Hello everyone, welcome to What If Ichigo Went Back in Time to Change Past Part 1. Chapter 1. The distant sound of a piddle paddle could be heard. It was not deafening, but it wasn't so quiet either. He should hear the drops of the rain, but his ears just couldn't register anything no matter how much he tried. His half-lidded eyes felt so heavy and as the tear droplets fell on his face and slid down his cheeks. He could barely make out the slight sting when they intruded his amber orbs. He was inclined on a tree trunk and he didn't know where, but it was most likely the woods. His body ached even if he was still and made no attempt to move. His breaths came out in harsh pants almost like if he had run a marathon. He coughed when he felt the air wasn't enough for his mangled lungs and felt the blood trickle down his chin to join the water on the floor. The little drops mingled together with the puddles of clear water and made it red. He honestly didn't know why he was still alive. He should have died hours ago, yet for some reason he refused to die. Just let this suffering end. He wasn't covered in a puddle of his own blood since he had most likely lost it all back there when he was injured. He could still feel the cold steel piercing his very being and couldn't avoid a small whimper from escaping his pale lips that had lost color along with the rest of his skin. His eyelids felt so heavy and he couldn't help but sigh in relief. Maybe, just maybe, he was finally dying. That brought a sense of happiness at the pit of his stomach. He could finally rest and follow his family and friends into death. He knew very well he would never meet them, more or less the chance since he was dying here, but he didn't care. The sense of ease that graced his very soul was enough to feel peaceful as his last breaths came closer and closer. He thought he heard a noise in the distance, but he really couldn't be sure. He could barely make out the sound of thunder and droplets, so of course, he couldn't hear a noise that was muffled by the rain. He coughed again, noticing that he didn't cough up any more blood, most likely because he just didn't have blood anymore. After all, he was dying, so why should the lack of blood matter? He felt the pounding in his chest slow down little by little as the minutes went by, minutes that seemed like hours. He started to feel numb, unsure if it was due to the cold rain he was drenched in or because he is dying. His eyes were almost closed now. He wanted to stay awake until the last of his breaths, but he might not make it. Not sleeping for such a long time had finally done a toll on him. He blinked once and then twice trying to avoid sleep. He wanted to die seeing the trees rustle with the wind, the blue sky, even if it was blocked with so many gray clouds. He really wanted to die gazing at his partner in arms, the beautiful blade that had saved him so many times and had taught him anything at his disposal. He really wanted to die with the pitch-black blade as the last thing he saw, but apparently his wish was not going to be granted. His eyelids slid closed to hide piercing amber eyes from the world sight. He gave out a last sigh as he could have sworn he heard another noise foreign from the precious melody the rain gave him. As he slipped into sleep from his exhaustion, at mere minutes away from his last breaths, he felt ever so slightly with the last of his senses the water droplets stopped falling and the winds pick up pace as they carried the clouds away into a distant land, maybe even more far away than he had ever traveled before. I'm sorry everyone, I won't be able to fulfill my promise. These were the last thoughts he registered in his unfocused mind as darkness engulfed it. A never-ending darkness, for some reason, not scary whatsoever. Chapter 2. Heavy eyelids slipped open very slowly, almost as if something were preventing him from doing so, but he was too stubborn to care. His amber eyes were completely open, and the first thing he saw was a wooden roof. He was lost in the wood like if he wasn't even seeing it when his eyes were very much staring straight at it. His thoughts were all jumbled up and he couldn't form coherent conclusions. He was very much lost in thought as he didn't move an inch from the soft surface he was lying on. He heaved out a slow breath to straighten out his thoughts, letting eyelids slide closed once more to try and think slowly and with all the logic he could muster. His thoughts wandered to the last thing he remembered, the raindrops, the numbness. He had died, hadn't he? He felt like he was going in circles. Every single thing he tried to remember to try and make a logical conclusion drove him to a soul one he was dying at that moment. He opened his eyes once more and this time turned his head to look at his right. A shoji door. He blinked to try and get the illusion out of his head, but it never left. He turned back to look at the roof before returning to his thoughts. Okay, there are no shoji doors after death. Well, if you die as a human and go to Soul Society, yes, but that's not the point. I died in Soul Society as a Shinigami. He was thoughtful to himself before nodding to no one in particular. Yes, a Shinigami. That would mean I would be reincarnated into the cycle of souls. So what am I doing here? Where am I? As he glanced this time to his left he saw a beautiful garden, the doors on that side were open, so he could see perfectly clear a green garden with some flowers here and there. Once he had stared rather intently at the garden he just couldn't reject it any longer. He just hadn't died. That was the answer, so now the next question. Where the hell was he? He carefully stood up with a groan, clutching his abdomen as a slight pain shot up through his system. He straightened himself up and tried to look at the whole room to find anything that might give him an answer as to where he was. His eyes stopped on a very familiar Nadachi, reclined on one of the walls. He strode to his sword with much care, one hand still clutching his abdomen, where he knew he had been fatally injured before, and the other hanging rather limply at his side. When he was right in front of the sheathed blade, he let out a small, very insignificant smile, and brought his free hand to grab it with much kindness, almost as if it were a living thing, that in a way he did consider them to be a living thing. "Oh, so you're awake." He was startled out of his trance-like state and quickly turned around at the fastest speed he could muster. He let go of his abdomen to grab the black hilt of his sword with a strong grip, in a defensive position ready to strike any second. Eyes narrowed and tangerine-colored brows furrowed together in a menacing scowl that would make the bravest man waver under his gaze. His eyes fell on the form of a man, taller than himself that also looked like he was double his own age. The man had long black hair tied together in a ponytail at the nape of his neck, the little amount of hair that was too short to be tied was spiky. The new intruder also happened to have piercing green eyes that in his current situation were as wide as saucers. "Whoa." The older man lifted his arms so that they were in sight, trying to show he meant no harm. He had a slightly panicked look on his face, but still held a half-smug smirk. "I won't hurt you, so calm down, okay?" The orange head never wavered in his stance, even though the pain was almost unbearable. He stayed in a defensive position, not trusting one bit the other's innocence, even though he had his hands in sight. "What makes you think I can trust you enough to let my sword down?" That had been the first time he had talked in some time now, and his voice came out as raspy as he expected it to be. He held back a cough that wanted to come out as a consequence and settled to stare at the man. The mystery man just let his hand drop to the side and made his smirk widen ever so slightly. "But the thing is, it didn't have an ounce of malice in it, he only had a nice and warm feeling to it. You don't have to trust me. But just to mention, I happen to be the one that got a healer in time before you died, and this also happens to be my house, so if you can at least relax, that would be great." The man's smirk never wavered even if he had a sword ready to be drawn right in front of him. Seeing that he would never get any answers from the black-haired man with his Zanpakuto ready to butcher him, he let out a shaky sigh before lowering his hand from the hilt, moving with much care to try and clutch his abdomen that felt like it would rip open if he stayed in the stiff stance he was. The pain shot throughout all his nerves and his knees gave out under him, falling into a crouching position, hands still grasping earnestly his Zanpakuto and stomach. "Ah fuck, I knew this would happen." The black-haired man went to the other side as quick as the other had fallen, supporting him back into the futon and making him sit in the best way possible so as to not worsen the injury that, as he realized, just no still hurt like a bitch. Once the apparent owner of the house finished his task of setting the orange head with much care, he sat down at the side, a smile still plastered very confidently on his face. "So, I guess I should introduce myself. My name is Shiba Rimter, second head of the noble Shiba family and captain of Squad 10. The orange head that had held no emotion whatsoever throughout the whole situation couldn't help but feel surprised. He was so surprised that his surprise flowed out into the open before he could put a lid onto his emotions, but as quickly as it decided to flow out it just disappeared. He struggled with the pain to shift lightly in his place to notice that the man indeed did carry a captain's haori on his back, something he hadn't noticed earlier since he was too busy being wary of his situation, which for the record, he still was. He never dropped the stare, thoughts going rapidly in his mind, trying to connect the dots of the mystery that had started the moment Kisuke had thrown him into that Sinkamen. He closed his eyes trying to let it all sink, his head hurting thanks to the major overdrive it had gone into. He let out a deep breath and slit eyelids open, the other's smirk still very present on his face and not even slightly disturbed by the orange head's stoic face. "Would you mind telling me your name?" Amber eyes lost eye contact with green as he looked at his hands that were gripping the futon with force he never intended to use. He thought of all the possibilities and outcomes of telling this Shiba his name and found no reason to not be able to. He was feeling way better in his presence now that he knew who he was and even more that he was apparently family, even if the other didn't know. "Ichigo, my name is Ichigo." Ichigo never looked up from his curled fists even when he heard the other shift in his place, now sitting cross-legged in a comfy and informal manner, something very normal only for the Shiba nobles. "Number 1 protector, huh? That's a good name." "No." Ryo barely registered the whisper that came out of the orange head. He was shocked by how dead and void his voice had sounded, even when he had just said one word. "That name does not suit me, I might as well be Strawberry." The raven head's eyes softened ever so slightly at seeing the other in such a broken state. He was really worried for him, why wouldn't he be, finding him in the middle of the woods half dead and then waking up in such a tense state, making him discover how broken the boy looked. Boy. He thought about that, he hated how in Soul Society it was so hard to tell age, but in his current situation he couldn't care less. Sure, the orange head looked no older than 18, but he might as well be his own age, even so he didn't care, he was only a boy in his eyes. Ryo couldn't suppress the sigh that escaped his lips as he stood up, leaving the boy still sitting on the futon with a tired expression on his face. "I have to go check some stuff out, but I'll be right back." If you need anything just call out, there is bound to be a servant around, so don't hesitate to speak up. He barely saw the nod he was given in response as it was almost unrecognizable. He let another sigh out as he strode out the wide open door and into the hall, leaving the other in his own musing. Now that Ichigo was left alone to his thoughts, he was finally able to concentrate on his theory. He lifted his gaze to look out the peaceful garden as memories flooded his very mind. You have to get out of here now. The explosions almost prevented the words from reaching his ears, but he was still able to make out what the 12th squad captain had yelled at him. He felt anger bubble up from the pit of his stomach that had a giant hole in it thanks to that bastard's cowardly move. I can still fight, damn it, I'm a captain not a child. The blonde only shook his head, glancing back at the youngest of their captains, and couldn't help the darkness that crept into his eyes at seeing the state he was in. The orange head had supported a deadly blast that would have killed any other. The newest of the captains had outdone them all by being able to endure that attack, but he knew that even being who he was he would not last much longer. He had acted as a shield, and now the shield was slowly crumbling. There is no time, it's not stable enough to last any longer, I'm not even sure it will work. Be careful and promise me you'll find a way to fix this mess. He held hope in his voice, hope that was very much heard by the other, even if his thoughts were a mess. But Kisuke, what are you talking about? Amber orbs widened at the panic reaching into his mind. Panic that was slowly but surely making the pain in his abdomen and in so much other places even more painful. He tensed when he felt the former shopkeeper place a firm yet gentle hand on his shoulder as he helped him support his mangled body. Ichi, just promise me you'll try and prevent this tragedy. Please. Ichigo just looked deeply into grey dull eyes trying to find an explanation, but quickly lost eye contact as another explosion shook the blood-stained floor they were standing on. Alright, I don't understand but I promise. He saw Kisuke's warm smile, but couldn't believe it, couldn't believe the smile that had disappeared after Yuruchi died resurfaced even if just for a second. His breath hitched in his throat and he barely registered being pushed into what looked like a Sankamen as he tried not to break eye contact with the other's sad grey eyes. Thank you. The sheer thought of that made him want to break down in that moment, not even caring, but he knew he couldn't, even if he wanted to, even if his heart constricted in pain the tears never fell. He knew now what Kisuke meant in that moment, the sorrow that was held in his eyes, as it was the last thing he saw before appearing in the middle of the woods. He connected the dots once more. Kisuke's promise, the Sankamen that was never a Sankamen, since there isn't one that would just change your location in Soul Society, the man Shiba Rimter. He had said he was the second family head, but Ichigo knew that the last head to ever have existed in his own family, the Shibas, was the 32nd head Shiba Kukaku. There was only one explanation to his current situation, but he still wanted to test his theory out. If he was right, Kisuke's Sankamen had sent him into the past and way into the past if the difference between 2 and 32 was something to say. He heaved out another slow but dreadful sigh as he pondered over what to do now. The man Shiba Rimter hadn't said anything about him leaving, so he still had some time, even if he didn't want to take advantage of the kind man. He was going to do something about the future, that was for sure, but for now his top priority was healing up enough to be able to move without pain and finding out how back he had gone. All of a sudden his senses went haywire and he noticed a strong yet steady Reiatsu just outside the room he was in. He didn't turn to see who it was, nor did he show he knew someone was there, he just stood still as the other also did the same. When the Reiatsu never left nor did it enter the room, he couldn't help the sudden urge he had to yell at the person. He instead settled with just voicing out his thoughts in a stern yet normal voice. I know you're there. He never turned from looking at the garden, but he was able to hear the small squeak that came from the other side of Rice doors. Suddenly he heard a small distinctively click, symbolizing that whoever was outside was now inside. I didn't mean to spy, I was just curious. Ichigo still didn't turn to look at the newcomer as her voice, since it was obviously feminine, flooded his hearing. He raised an eyebrow at the last word and couldn't stop himself from voicing out his own thoughts. Curious. This time the timid voice seemed to gain confidence upon noticing his voice didn't hold any annoyance or malice. Why yeah. Chichiyu said you had woken up, so I was sorta curious, sorry. As he heard the apology he felt a sudden urge to face her and deny it. His head turned and his amber eyes fell on equally amber ones. He was glued to her eyes that held the same spark his had a long time ago, not being able to move from the innocent orbs that stared right back at him. He finally noticed what he was doing and cleared his throat to grab her attention as she was also mesmerized in his own eyes. There's nothing to apologize about. I wasn't doing anything anyways. When he looked back at the girl he was finally able to look at her appearance. She had black silky hair that reached her hips, it had a red brioche on her left side that was neatly keeping her hair from her amber eyes. She was at least 1.60 meters 5'2", not as tall as his 1.81 meters 5'11", but tall in her own way. The girl, since she looked no older than 17, had white silky skin that now that he noticed was lightly tinted pink in her cheeks, a discreet yet very visible flush. "Oh okay my name is Shiba Haruka." He nodded before realizing she was waiting for his reply and opened his own mouth to speak. "Ichigo, it's nice to meet you Shiba-san." She instantly brightened up and broke into a wide smile before finally registering how Ichigo had called her and quickly changing it into a scowl. "You can call me Haruka, it's confusing with more than one Shiba in the house." He nodded once more, taking in the new piece of information that this girl that looked similar to his age had provided. Apparently there was more than one Shiba in this house, he at least knew there were two, who knew how many more there were. "And you can call me Ichigo." He quickly noticed his own mistake and went to follow his sentence, stammering slightly since he was in a hurry to not mess up and give unnecessary information. "Since I only have that, you know." Her smile returned as she laughed at his obvious mistake, thinking he had forgotten he only had one name. Ichigo only stared at her with an eyebrow raised, thinking how she could laugh so easily and how she seemed to be too relaxed in a room with a man she barely knew when said man had his Zanpakuto right beside him. He was about to inquire about that when the door slid open, revealing the first person he had actually met and had apparently saved his life with someone else he was never expecting to see towing right behind. "Hey Ichigo, sorry to interrupt, but I brought the healer I told you about in the beginning. The best of the best, Captain of Squad 4 Korinji Tinjirou." Ichigo was about to be somewhat nice and respond instead of just staying quiet like a bastard that had no manners or ignores people, but he was cut off by none other than the current captain of Squad 4. "Hey Rimter, you forgot that I'm also called Lightning Speed Tinjirou." The orange head only blinked in surprise when the head of the Shiba clan gave Tinjirou a hard slap on the head. "Stop being so rude, you're scaring the poor boy." "Yeah well maybe it's you that's scaring him, crazy Shibas and their crazy antics. What you say you're the one that started to yell out of nowhere. Why would he care of your self-proclaimed title? How many times do I have to tell you it's not self-proclaimed, it's a fact." Ichigo didn't let his eyes leave the scene that was playing out right in front of him, thinking how friendly they were with each other and how it reminded him so much of the past when he would argue like that with Renji or Ishida. He was suddenly startled when a stern and annoyed voice was heard. "Quite you two." The two adults' quarrel was cut short by the person Ichigo would never expect it from. He turned his gaze from the two men that had each other held by the collar of their shihakushos, frozen in place, to the source of the yell, which had been none other than Haruka. "You two are acting like babies, when will there be a single time when you won't fight over every little thing?" The two now held a sorry face, Tinjirou rubbing the back of his head, sheepishly mumbling under his breath, something about unfair, and Rimter pouting, trying to look as innocent as possible. "But Haru," he started. The person in question only gave a glare as a response before turning to look at the orange head, expecting him to be freaked out or at least startled by the sudden scene that happened right before him, only to find Ichigo as neutral as ever. She raised an eyebrow, gaining the two elder men's attention when they realized that he had indeed stayed quiet and calm the whole time. "What?" Ichigo only tilted his head slightly to the side to prove his point and show he really had no idea why they were staring at him when he suddenly remembered that those kinds of antics were only normal for Shibas. "Damn. No, it's just that I thought you would be freaked out or something." Thinking as fast as he could and grabbing onto the first thing that came to mind, he responded in an equally normal and not even bothered tone. "Well, you see a lot of crazy things in Rukongai." Hoping it was enough of an answer, he brought his attention back to the man he had only met thanks to the war and hardships that had even made the Zero Squad intervene. Said man was calmer now that Haruka had put both of them in their place, but he still held a cheeky smirk on his face. He was also younger than he remembered, but of course that was a given since Tinjirou was one of the first to join the original Gate 13. This gave him a clue as to how back he had really gone, so he thought it was a useful fact. "It's nice to meet you Tinjirou-san. My name is Ichigo, but you probably already know that." Tinjirou's smirk only widened now that the attention was back on him, and realizing that Ichigo had made a pretty accurate comment, he couldn't avoid it either. "Yup, this guy here told me what he knew on the way back, but what I'm really here for is to check how your wounds are coming along, since this idiot here also mentioned you were in pain." "Who are you call?" The Shiba's protest was cut off in mid-sentence when he was hit rather hard in the head by Haruka, said person still carrying a rather menacing gaze that showed just how annoyed she was. Trace of the shy girl Ichigo had seen mere minutes ago nowhere in sight. "Behave yourself Chichu." Her father only crossed his arms over his chest, grabbing onto a rather childish in Ichigo's opinion face that showed how he really was. He thought of how lucky Haruka was that this Shiba didn't wail and cry like his own idiot of a Shiba father. Ichigo turned back to the healer and nodded, standing up so that he would have better access to his abdomen where the pain was worse. He opened up the white shitage too he was wearing and waited patiently as Tinjirou got closer, thumb rubbing thoughtfully on his chin and looking at his bandage-covered abdomen. Well, I usually punch my patients to see if they're completely healed." Ichigo saw Haruka scowl once more, about to open her mouth to protest with a terrified look on her face when the fourth squad captain held a hand up stopping her. But since most my patients are Shinigami that are pretty strong in my opinion, I really can't do that with you, so I'll have to do it the old-fashioned way." He nodded, not even fazed by the mere thought of being punched by an expert in Hakuta 3. He watched carefully as the bandages were slowly removed from his chest and the injury came in sight. It was still pink, barely sticking itself together. He looked at the rest of his upper body so full of scars, some that looked as nasty as they did when they had barely been healed and others that looked old and barely there. Ichigo also knew there were thin scars running all over his back, clearly made by a whip, but if anybody realized it, they didn't comment on it. He felt a new bandage being wrapped in place after the injury was cleaned and checked, noticing how all the other injuries he had sustained were gone and couldn't help but feel curious. What happened to my other wounds? He received an incredulous look from the healer in question as he finished the last procedures. Tinjirou stared directly into the depths of amber eyes until he gave out a sigh and shook his head. "They healed 2 days ago, you were out of it for at least 5 days." Ichigo kept on staring into the other's eyes, letting the news sink in his mind. He had been out for 5 days. 5 days had passed since then and he still felt like shit. That just shows how bad the injury really was. He was brought back from his musing when he heard the other's voice once more. "Let me tell you, I didn't think you would make it, but seeing you as well as you are now, it's seriously a miracle you survived." The orange head looked down at his wound that was already covered in bandages, deciding to pull back his shiitake. His thoughts brought a certain conclusion to mind and he realized he should have thanked Rimter a long time ago. "Rimter-san, I forgot to thank you earlier and also thanks to you to Tinjirou-san." Both men in question looked at each other before breaking into a small fit of laughter, finding something funny where Ichigo could find no such thing. "Sorry about that, kid, no need to thank me, it was Rim that found you, not me, I only healed you. Your thanks are accepted, but there really is no need. I did it cause I wanted to, and that's all." Rimter now had the largest grin Ichigo had seen on the man, one of pure happiness and no alternate meaning to it, and seeing this Ichigo couldn't help but compare the Shiba before him with his own dad, very similar but still different. Thinking about his dad brought a small smile to his own face, but even as it held sadness in it, there was still a small warm trace. The smile did not go unnoticed by the three, even if it did go unnoticed by the owner of it, and a similar thought passed through their minds as they thought of how that smile was the closest thing the orange-headed showed as a sign of positive emotion. "1. So what do you think about the boy?" The two captains were walking through the halls of the Shiba Manor, making their way to the head's private quarters to try and get more privacy with a cup of tea or even sake. "Rimter, that's no boy you got yourself," said Captain only nodded as he opened the shoji door into one of his rooms. This one in particular only holding a low table, cushions and some sake bottles with their cups on a counter. He sat down, placing a cup of sake in front of both and a bottle in the middle of the table, before finally speaking up. "I think so too." His eyes hold a haunted feeling to them and it breaks my heart to see such a young person with that sort of expression. I just wonder what happened to him to make him like this." Tinjirou had already served them both a full cup of sake. The fourth squad captain only took a sip before looking at the other with the most serious face he could muster. "You saw all those scars, right?" Upon seeing the other nod slowly, he closed his eyes briefly, only to open them again, gaze hard and in the depth of it all, pissed. "Some of them are obviously the work of torture." Rimter's breath hitched in his throat and he hissed at the mere thought of it, opening his mouth to give a response, but not being able to find one at the same time. "The ones on his back are whips, there's some scars on his wrists that have shackles written all over them, he has even more scars, but if they're all from torture or battle I don't know." Tinjirou never wavered from his sudden serious gaze, and Rim could only stare before taking a sip of the sake, trying to let this newfound information sink in as best as it could. "He's that bad?" The other's only answer was to grab the sake bottle and fill up his cup once more before gazing up and looking directly into green eyes. "With all this I can tell you he did not overreact upon seeing you." Rimter tilted his head, showing off his obvious confused state. "What do you mean? Do you think almost having a sword in the gut was not overreacting?" "That's exactly what I mean. Being in the state he was, having had hardships we couldn't hope of knowing, it's a real mystery why he's more at ease now. I would have thought him to be more untrusting." The head of the Shiba clan gave out a long sigh before gripping his cup and completely downing the sake, placing the cup back on the table with force enough to back up his somewhat pissed off state. "I was going to let him stay here as long as he needed and as long as he wanted, but now I just can't find it in myself to let him leave." He gave out another sigh before pinching the bridge of his nose, eyes lid sliding closed to hide green orbs behind before opening them once again. It all makes more sense now, his obvious distrust, how weary he was even though he looked like he was sitting calmly on the futon, the haunted look in his eyes, and the way he seems to space off sometimes. "I can't believe how much I want to thank whoever put him in my path that rainy night." The captain of the fourth squad took another sip of his sake, trying to savor it at the best of his possibilities. "What are you thinking of doing?" The other only glanced up to look at his comrade, a fierce determination burning in his green eyes as they didn't waver for a second. I think you already know. Tinjirou only smirked as he downed the last of his cup, trying to look as serious as possible with a smug smirk on his face. Maybe I do. 1. Are you sure you don't need to rest? I mean I can leave. I don't have anything to do so I really don't mind if anything I bet you'd be bored with me more than anything. Amber eyes glanced worriedly at the orange head that was sitting right beside. She couldn't get her eyes off him for some reason and her curiosity wasn't helping one bit. This boy had been a mystery from the moment he had been dragged into the manor on her father's back, Tinjirou right behind with a palm illuminated with green, lingering as closely as possible to the worst injury that was visible thanks to the tattered clothing the orange head wore. In that moment she couldn't avoid freaking out feeling a dread at the sight of all the blood and hoping her younger brother wouldn't wake up or he would be traumatized for life. She glanced back at the other, the curiosity getting the best of her and not realizing until she had spoken up. How did you get that injured? She quickly noticed her mistake and panicked slightly, trying to form a coherent sentence to avoid making him bothered by the rather intruding question. I mean if it's okay to tell me. Ichigo didn't let the thought bother him on the outside, even if in the inside he felt almost broken. He tried to heave out a silent breath to get the pieces back together, sticking and gluing shattered and broken pieces of his own soul. We were attacked and I tried to be a shield. That was the best answer he could muster no matter how hard he tried, after all, an explanation of how an evil mastermind had tried to kill the majority of the future captains that had yet to even exist and that he had gotten badly injured taking in the blast was not one he thought she would believe. In return Haruka only nodded her head, realizing it was a very painful topic and cursing at her own stupidity. After all, why would the orange head even talk about such things to someone he had just met hours ago? She glanced back rather nervously to look at him, noticing how the soft breeze of the garden flew into the room and moved gently his very slightly long orange locks. She looked at the bright hair thinking how he didn't seem bothered when his hair was sometimes obstructing his vision and how it might even tickle the nape of his neck when it was moved. She looked away from the boy that looked no older than herself and went back to gazing at the peaceful garden that had, for some reason, never left the other's eyes. The sun was starting to set and the night started to enhance the peaceful sight, engulfing them along with it. She heard footsteps and looked up noticing a servant carrying none other than her little brother. Sorry to bother you Oju-sama but I'm turning on the lanterns before tucking in young Wataru to bed. The sound of a new voice brought Ichigo's attention as he looked away from the garden that helped him find peace, only to see a normal everyday servant carrying a boy with soft black hair just like Haruka's, piercing green eyes, and an innocent and very childlike expression in place. The child in Ichigo's eyes looked no older than 4 years old, but he knew that looks were not always the truth in the matter of age. Take him for example, he was already 38, but he still looked like someone in his senior year of high school. The little boy, Wataru gave him a wide smile that reminded him so much of himself when he was that age. He blinked before realizing that not responding would scare him and gave the little boy a small smile in return. Haruka all of a sudden stood up to ruffle the black tuft of hair that Wataru had before speaking up in a calm and warm voice, not in the least demanding or annoyed like one would expect from a noble family. It's okay you weren't interrupting. How's Wataru-chan behaving? Said boy only gave a cute pout in response, big green eyes staring right into Haruka's amber ones. I'm a good boy Haruna. Haruka only gave out a chuckle in response, not halting her soft caresses as she smiled rather warmly at the boy. Big green eyes flickered their attention back to Ichigo as he seemed rather interested in the guest and his bright orange hair. Realizing this Haruka took a step to the side to have Ichigo be in complete sight, said person stood up from his place on the wooden porch, trying to be as friendly as possible for the young boy. Wataru-chan this is Ichigo he'll be staying here for a while, so be nice okay. Said boy only nodded rather earnestly wiggling his way out of the servant's way to stand upright in front of Ichigo, a serious and determined gaze that just looked ridiculous on the boy. This made Ichigo's smile even more genuine as he couldn't seem to be able to hold his stoic demeanor in front of the young Shiba. Said boy only nodded before giving out a tiny hand to shake Ichigo's, noticing the gesture Ichigo knelt down and gave his own hand in response, even if Wataru was only able to grasp 3 of his fingers with his hand. Hello, Wataru-chan. You will be Ichi-nai from now on. Haruka and the servant that was still there watching the scene with curiosity blinked in surprise, Wataru being way straighter forward than ever before. Haruka was about to tell Wataru how rude it could be for Ichigo and that he should first ask if he can call him that only to stop on her tracks. Not only was Wataru being friendly and not acting shy like he always did, but Ichigo had a genuine warm smile that spoke of much kindness and how fond he had already gotten of the small boy. I don't mind. Wataru beamed into a wide smile as he seemed very pleased with himself and his current achievement. He let go of the bigger hand and went to grasp the servant's smaller one, surprising her if only for a moment. Thank you, bye-bye Ichi-nai. Ichigo could only wave at the small boy as he left through the corridors, trying to pull on the servant towards the opposite direction. The lady only turned as fast she could to give a shallow bow before voicing out her excuses. "If you excuse me, Oju-sama, Ichigo dono." As the two disappeared into a corridor, Ichigo stood up once more, wincing under his breath at the sudden movement and trying to avoid Haruka from realizing. He glanced to his side when he noticed a stare being directed his way, only to see it was none other than Haruka. He raised an eyebrow about to inquire on why she was staring at him when she beat him to the punch, surprising him by what came out. "In the 3 hours or so you've been awake, you befriended my shy and somewhat antisocial little brother. Just what the hell did you do?" She raised her arms in an exasperated way to prove her own point, glaring ever so slightly into Ichigo's direction and trying to squeeze an answer out of him if he tried not to answer himself. Ichigo in response lifted his hands in a way to defend himself from the girl's harmless inquiry. He honestly didn't know himself, so just stood thoughtful, hands still raised in front of his chest as to prevent anything Haruka may throw his way. "Well, I really don't know, it was just instinct, I guess." He shrugged the feeling off, knowing the real reason why, but not wanting to even admit it to himself since it would only bring back painful memories that at the moment are not welcome even after so much time has passed. Ichigo gave another quick glance to the shorter girl to see her sighing and actually accepting his response as an answer. Ichigo knew she was only being considerate since she didn't want him to feel uncomfortable, and he couldn't be more grateful. His own soul was still very much locked up, not even close to being able to open up to another, even if that person were someone Ichigo trusted with his life. So now it didn't even matter because there were no longer people that fell in that category with him. Pushing the thought aside, he noticed how the winds flew gently, rustling the trees, giving the garden's view an even better beauty and a whole new level. "What do you see so much in that garden?" He was startled when he heard Haruka voice out her thoughts only a little bit behind him. He turned from the garden only to face her, a neutral and very much practiced voice in place, when that was void of any emotion that didn't betray any of his inner feelings. "Memories. Memories that will always be there no matter what." Once those words were muttered, she never spoke up again, opting to stay silent and gaze at the garden with him and sometimes steal a glance or two his way. It stayed that way until she excused herself, stating she had to sleep or else she wouldn't be able to wake up the next day, and Ichigo acknowledged her point with only a swift and slow nod, never speaking up that night, only gazing at the moonlit garden that held its own mystery behind it. Neither of the two noticed that the Shiba head was standing rather silently in the shadows, a somber expression held in place, and Riatsu kept neatly but completely suppressed. He had been there since his youngest came out and showed much comfort with the orange head, but he never knew how to make his presence known, and then with the somewhat awkward silence left it ended up worse. So when her daughter decided to retire for the night, he couldn't help but take hold of the opportunity at hand. He came out slowly from within the shadows and at the same time making his presence known little by little so the boy wouldn't be startled by his sudden appearance. He was actually surprised at the moment he started to let his Riatsu flow was the moment Ichigo turned around to face in his direction. When he saw this, he couldn't help but feel curious as to how much the boy knew of Riatsu and how to feel people's presence. He concluded that since Ichigo hadn't turned when he had his Riatsu muted, the most accurate conclusion would be that he really didn't notice him until now. He decided to act like that was the case, casually walking towards him and getting in place right beside him as Ichigo turned back his gaze towards the full moon that happened to be out tonight. "Can't sleep?" Ichigo only nodded thoughtfully as he comprehended the complete meaning of those words and thinking that Rimter might as well want to hear a reason as to why. "It's been hard to sleep for some time now, so I don't even bother trying when I know I won't be able to succeed anyway." The captain gave Ichigo a questioning but brief glance before returning to watch the moon in its full beauty, thinking that the night was spectacular and that if it were any other day he would have invited Tinjirou to stay and have some more sake under the light of the moon. "Then do you want to eat? I mean, if you're not going to sleep then maybe you'd want to eat something you haven't really eaten at all since you were unconscious." Ichigo pondered for a second, placing a hand over his stomach and thinking that he wasn't really hungry. He shook his head rather intently to prove his point that he really wasn't in the mood for food, even if he knew he should at least feel some sort of hunger. But of course food wasn't something his body needed to continue functioning in some time, so it was reasonable that his body didn't really feel like it. Food wasn't easy found in the middle of the desert or the battlefield. Rimter let out a slow yet somewhat depressing sigh, gaining the orange head's attention in the process. Hearing the other, Ichigo turned to look at him, tilting his head to the side in a moment of honest confusion. He was about to inquire on the fact when he was abruptly cut off. "You don't have to be so shy about it, you know, my home is your home." The Shiba head broke into a small warm smile to prove his point, and the orange head pondered over the fact before turning back to the present tense squad captain, a serious and honest expression in place. "I really am grateful and I couldn't ever hope to repay you, but I'm not being shy. I may have lived through hell, hardships and seen many awful things, but I'm not helpless, I can take care of myself." Rimter blinked in surprise, taken aback by how determined and riled up he was. This was not what he was expecting, but it didn't disappoint him for even a second, quite the contrary actually. This boy has guts. He broke into a wide smile, clearly showing his comfort at Ichigo's reaction and not in the least offended by his words. He grasped tightly the orange-head's shoulder to give him a warm squeeze, gaining his full attention once more. I was just making sure, but I'm glad. Seeing the older man's expression, Ichigo returned a small smile, eyes flickering from dull amber to fierce bright amber for just a second, surprising the clan head even if just a little. They stayed like this, in silence, one that was calm and not awkward, both gazing into the night sky with a smile even if Rimter's was bigger on their face. The silence was only broken after time passed as the older of the two shifted in his seat to stand up, a pop being heard showing how sore he was. He stretched to relieve the soreness, and Ichigo just looked at him curiously wondering what he was doing. I think I should go rest myself. You should try and get some as well, don't want you passing out on us from exhaustion. Ichigo nodded, standing up as well and thinking that it wouldn't help to try even if he just slept a few hours. He was about to enter the room he had woken up in when Rimter grasped his shoulder and shook his head. We have a new room for you. We had this one for convenience since it's close to the entrance and it was hard to move you when you were unconscious. But now that you're awake you can use the real guest room. Alright. Lead the way. The Shiba head gave one of his smug smirks, motioning Ichigo to follow him into the endless hallways. They walked in silence until the raven head stopped just outside a pair of shoji doors, more into the manor, but still facing the garden in a different area. He actually liked this area more. This will be your new room. He opened the doors to reveal a normal room that actually held furniture. Furniture being a dressing table, a bigger futon, a low table with zabuton 5 stacked neatly at the side, and some decorations that made the room look livelier. In the same room were two other smaller doors that he could only guess as to what was behind. Rim entered the room, Ichigo towing right behind as he strode directly to one of the doors that Ichigo had just wondered about. This door leads to a bathroom, and this other one goes to a closet. The current 10th squad captain opened the closet door, surprising the orange head when a rainbow of clothing came in view from the other side. Wow. Rimter looked back to see Ichigo's surprised expression, having a smug smirk himself, as he was very much enjoying the other's expressions. He just loved how Ichigo would drop his barriers even if just a little if he was either comfortable or just plain distracted. Use anything you like that actually fits, we receive a lot of presents from other noble families, and some just don't fit so suit yourself. Thanks, I think I'll take a bath before trying to sleep. The raven head only widened his smirk, obtaining a small but real smile from the other. He turned to leave the room, letting Ichigo prepare himself for bed and hope he could rest when he stopped, one foot in the hallway and the other still inside the room. He turned around, a serious expression where a smug grin was mere seconds ago, and he called out, voice firm, but not a trace of demand in it. Can I ask you a question? Ichigo turned slightly, just enough to see the man from the corner of his eye, but not facing him completely. The raven head just stood there and Ichigo did the same, a neutral expression plastered in place until he found the courage to speak up. Go ahead. You deserve an answer, it's the least I could do. Rimter never hesitated in his hard gaze, eyes full of hope and respect, not an ounce of pity in sight, something Ichigo was silently grateful for. How long did this hell of yours last? The orange head was taken aback by the simplicity of the question. A question that brought down all his plans and the backstory he had created in his free time. He turned, completely this time, and fierce amber met determined green. The sudden tense atmosphere was created, but not in the least awkward as both stood in silence, one waiting for an answer and the other running through his mind. Ichigo's fierce gaze never wavered, it never left as memories of the war passed through his thoughts, it never trickled away like it did most of the time to be replaced by dull amber when the corpses of his friends, family, comrades and subordinates crossed his mind. He held his gaze as he made a silent promise to himself that he would prevent the tragedy no matter what, and as he finally found the courage to speak up his answer, he never chalked on his words, only strength and determination was found. 20 years. And as the two words were voiced out, a burden of guilt was lifted off the poor broken soul, guilt that no matter what was said to him, he had always believed to be legitimate. But the sad part about the lifted guilt was not in the fact that it was misplaced guilt, no, that would be too simple for a man of impossibilities like Ichigo. The sad part was that the only reason it left was to be replaced by pain. Deep and very much fictitious pain at being torn apart and glued back together with only himself as support. Something that would sooner or later make it too much of a burden as memories would flood in with all the time he had. Chapter 3, Mitsuri 1. The orange head glanced to arch an eyebrow at the over-enthusiastic Shiba that almost looked like she was jumping in her seat. Her amber eyes were wide and held the puppy look that made him want to soften up, but of course being who he was he took nothing of it and hardened his scowl along with his resolve as to not fall by the illusion. Yeah. Let's go to the TMRM Nagashi Mitsuri. 2. And here was the disaster to come. After been residing in the Shiba manor for 3 days awake, he now knew how hard it was to say no to the Shiba princess, not because she always got away with everything or that she was overly spoiled, no, nothing like that. The reason being that it was better to go with her flow than fall victim to the cute puppy dog eyes or, just putting it plainly, gain a broken nose. So here he was now, suppressing the urge to throw his hands up to show his exasperation. He really didn't feel like doing well anything. Sure, his injuries didn't hurt anymore, so long as he didn't strain himself or stuff like that, but he still didn't quite feel it 100%. Now back in his time he would have said screw this and would have thrown himself into battle as soon as he was able to hold his sword, but now even if he wanted to he couldn't. Number 1 being he really had no hurry to defeat enemies or protect comrades, and secondly being that the Shibas just didn't let him. Ichigo had known how stubborn Shibas were, he should know, he is one after all, but this was just ridiculous. The moment he had mentioned that he help around the manor or do something, the Shiba head and the Shiba princess as he had dubbed her started to make a fuss like mother hens and had stubbornly prohibited him from doing anything more than stand, walk, sleep, eat or change, and that was just driving him insane. He wasn't one to be fawned over, heck he was the one that always did the fawning, so not only having one, but 2 being over him was slightly weird if not odd. I can't do anything, remember. Princess's orders. She sent a glare his way, obviously unamused by the fact that he was now throwing her own words against her and the fact that he kept calling her by that name. She seriously would have given him a through and all beating if he wasn't recuperating, so instead she satisfied herself by sending a smug smirk his way, one that held a hidden message that sent a sudden chill down Ichigo's spine. Going to the festival isn't tiring. You only walk, eat from the stands, look at the fireworks and send out the lanterns. Nothing special that can make you strain yourself. Ichigo in return scoffed, seeing where the conversation was going, but not quite ready to lose the debate, so instead he satisfied himself with trying one last time to beat her and maybe, just maybe not fall victim, and say yes in the end. If I'm good enough to go to the TMRM Nagashi Mitsuri, I should be good enough to get back to my life and leave, don't you think? This got him a reaction, though not the one he wanted, but he guessed it was something because the raven head flattered even if just for a second. After she composed herself a thoughtful expression marred her face, one that held hesitation before it was replaced by pure warmth, a small smile slowly curling up her lips. You should know why you still haven't left to continue your life. And this was because she just couldn't call the way Ichigo lived a life. Sure, she hadn't been told anything about his lifestyle of before her father found him, but she had made her own implications. How could one not when someone arrives half dead at your doorstep? So she was more than sure that Ichigo's life was more than hectic, if not plain miserable. Besides, the orange head didn't even have someone to return to, this he had actually mentioned on his own free will, so she just couldn't find a reason to return to the streets, even when he had a chance to stay. And of course he'd been offered that decision 2 days ago by none other than the Shiba head himself, but he had yet to answer, not really saying no, but neither saying yes. So, once Haruka blurted out that sole sentence, his thoughts went running back to that night, hesitation and some sort of fear dawning into his mind. 20 years. Neither spoke as the silence seemed to be as unsettling as one would expect from a conversation of this caliber. The void atmosphere never seemed to waver in its impenetrable quiet, and it stayed that way for a good 10 minutes before Rimter even gained the confidence to sigh and look away from the fierce amber that stared right back at him. The Shiba head brought a hand to scrub over his face, obviously fed up with the stillness that suddenly came over them. So instead he decided to speak up his mind and get it over with. Better now than never. It'd be stupid of me to start saying how sorry I am and that I understand your pain because I seriously can't. But I can tell you that you are nothing if not alone. He stopped for a second to release a breath as he took in the orange head's dumbfounded expression, at least he wasn't angry. Rimter looked directly into amber, wide eyes as he continued, voice full of determination and real sincerity more than anything. I want to ask something of you, Ichigo, would you be willing to stay with us? We'll never ask what you do not want to answer, we don't need anything from you, so please would you become a part of our family? Silence seemed to engulf them, but it didn't feel awkward or anything of that sort. Rimter's fond and warm smile cleared up the thickness that could have been formed, as if the small gesture was enough to make the atmosphere relaxed and somewhat peaceful. He saw how Ichigo looked at the ground, finding it more interesting than holding his fierce eyes and looking at him, but he didn't mind. Rimter saw how the slightly long orange bangs covered Ichigo's face to make it a complete mystery as to what was behind, but it never bothered him. Instead he took one last glance at the teen before muttering brief but warm words, think about it. And just like that he stalked out, leaving a very much stunned strawberry behind, but never glancing back, knowing with no doubt that if he did he would demand an answer, and Ichigo was grateful for the gesture because he seriously wasn't ready to give one. The man never asked for an answer even after 2 days had passed. He had acted like the thing never happened, but he knew it did because Haruka had been told the next day and started to pester him that he should stay and that he had no reason to return to the slums. Still Ichigo never answered to the Shiba princess either, he just stayed quiet when the topic came with his many talks with Haruka, and this particular one was going to end no different. Haruka gave out a long, slow sigh before shaking her head in a disapproving manner, even though she didn't question a thing, instead she settled for giving a stern look and giving the final verdict. Anyway, we're going to the festival together, so get ready. But that she stood from her seated position in the wooden hallway besides the orange head to give him a smile from above, obviously pleased that she was currently taller than him and that he hadn't reproached, just settled for a glare that didn't look at all menacing from beneath her. No need to brood, so you might as well have fun, K. He just gave out a reluctant sigh before nodding his head in a defeated manner, glancing up at the raven head and looking at her amused smile from the corner of his eyes before the smallest of smirks curled up his lips, discarding the glare that seriously had no use with her. Alright, I guess I can try. Her smile widened as she beamed with happiness and took off in a hurry, obviously going to get ready and notify her idiotic father of the news. Once she was out of sight, Ichigo's smile wavered as his face returned to his own shutout mask, one that wasn't particularly stoic like the Kichiki's, even if it didn't betray his own feelings for a second. His mask was more like a neutral kind of face, one that read uncaring but didn't say anything else, even when his fierce amber eyes stood out when he occasionally had them. He shook his head as his gaze lingered onto the beautiful sakura tree that was starting to shed its own petals, being carried off by the wind and making a majestic sight to look at. But even as his eyes were on the pink-colored petals, his mind was somewhere else, lost in thoughts and hesitations that just made his case worse, because he knew the answer before Rimter had even stopped talking that night, and that fact scared him. It scared him to think that his own heart would jump head on the moment he had been offered a place, a family to belong to. He just couldn't decipher the feelings of longings that never seemed to leave his mind when he thought about that chance. A chance that made him beam with happiness and at the same time want to tear up. Would this mean he was replacing his family? If so, he just didn't want it, so he kept on pushing it aside. He just couldn't accept his own resolve at the moment, and that was just ridiculous. So instead of losing his head on something that clearly had no answer at the moment, he stood up, gaze flickering briefly towards the hallways, before realizing there wasn't even a need to be on edge. It was hard to tone down battle instincts, that was for sure. Ignoring the observation, he went off to his own room, Rice door sliding softly behind and clicking in an obvious sign of closing. Ichigo stood there, inside his room, but not quite leaving the door just yet. He sighed before giving himself a shake of the head, cursing at his own hesitation and deciding to concentrate on the matter at hand. He needed to get ready for the TMRM Nagashi Mitsuri. This is just so damn frickin' confusing. He seriously considered tearing his own hair off his head. It was stupid and stressful because he knew already his decisions were just being fogged up and blinded, and that more than anything annoyed the hell out of him. It wouldn't be if you only stopped lying to yourself. And this was another thing. His Zanpakuto spirits. Ichigo had tried to find some sort of peace and comfort and had fled into his inner world when he noticed he had time to spare before the festival and the fact that he was already changed and ready to go, but the two just weren't being of any use. If anything, they seemed to leave the orange head to deal with it on his own, and that was frustrating. Weren't they supposed to assist him? He scowled once the word sunk in because he wasn't expecting a reply now, and much less that. He really did know what he wanted, just like his own soul had said mere seconds ago, but the thing was that he felt hesitant, even if he knew perfectly fine what he wanted, what he preferred, but he couldn't choose thanks to his own useless thoughts, only increasing his fear. How would this affect the future? Would it bring too much attention to himself? What would he do from here on if he still had centuries to spare? I'm not lying myself, I'm trying to make the right decision, and you two are not helping. This brought a reaction from the albino that had uninterested until now. He turned around to glare at his wielder before letting out a snarl, not satisfied with Ichigo's actions and indecision. The king is king because he has his people, but you're just ignoring your people, your soul. You are king of this fucked up soul of yours, so you already know what we want, so stop angsting like a goddamn teenager and take your pick. It brought a certain realization to him, it really did, and he knew his choice from the very beginning. He was just wavering, thinking of the what ifs. He needed to get a grip, he had only one goal in mind, how he accomplished it, he shouldn't care less, it just had to guarantee to stop the war in the end. He stayed silent, getting a conclusion, but not wanting to voice it out as he still had a flicker of hesitation weighing him down, so instead he turned around and silently started to walk away towards the edge of a blue building to disappear back into consciousness, but was stopped when a stern hand was placed on his shoulder. Ichigo glanced back to look at the old man, which happened to be a part of Zangetsu in his own way. He stared at him from the corner of a stoic amber eye, not showing an ounce of emotion, even though it was impossible to hide them from his very own soul. I couldn't have put it in any other way, even if Shiro did add an extra, but Ichigo, you've never hesitated on your choices before, always honest with yourself and doing what you thought was right, and maybe sometimes it made things go wrong, but you were always able to fix them in the end. A brief flicker of pride passed through his eyes as he squeezed Ichigo's shoulder to give him some comfort and show how honest he was with his words, because if he had ever admired anything from his wielder, it had been his strong will to do what was right, so he really wanted to get his point across. Now is not the time to ignore that part of you, and I wouldn't think you would need us to remind you of who you are, what makes you the person we, and many others are proud of. Don't hesitate, Ichigo, you will only die in the process. The orange head in return gave a small barely distinguishable smile, but it was enough for both of them, because even if he didn't show it, they knew how Ichigo felt perfectly fine. They both saw how their king started walking to the edge once more, confidence inscribed into his very being, showing it as vividly as the day, even in the way he walked and strode to the end of the building. No faltering, never wavering, always going forward, never looking back, and as he stood one step away from the ledge, he spoke up in a hushed yet stern and determined voice they had yet to hear in a long time. "Thank you." And with that he was off, slowly disappearing into nothingness and awakening in the outside world to face his life with newfound determination and confidence that was always present, it had only been muted. But now, he would no longer hesitate. "I will stop looking back." Too, he had been startled, that was for sure. Why wouldn't he be when he was peacefully filling out paperwork and all of a sudden an overexcited Shiba Haruka broke into his office and all but demanded they all go to the TMRM. Nagashi Mitsuri, with such radiance in her eyes, one would think she had just won a contest or something. So, when he had finally been able to calm her down and make her explain her reasons, she never acted so excited over events like these. He had been more than a little shocked when the realization dawned over him that Ichigo of all people had actually agreed to go and had promised involuntarily agreed he would try and have some fun. So once he had gotten the full gist of the situation, including her failed attempt at cornering Ichigo into accepting his proposal, he stood up, pushed the paperwork aside, and had hurried over to get ready himself, along with little Wataru. They would all go as a family, maybe make Ichigo realize how well he could had fit well already into the Shibas. And now, a mere hour later, he was striding down a hallway, making way towards the room he knew the young orange head resided in, with gleam and happiness written all over his face. Once he caught sight of the room, he couldn't help but feel even more satisfied that they could go out and that the boy had actually accepted, though reluctantly, and that they could coax him out of the manor now that he could move without pain. So as he stood outside of the room with a smug smirk on his face, he called out to the occupant of the room as he noticed the steady yet small Ryatsu inside the room. "Boy, Ichigo. You ready? Haruka is already at the entrance with Wataru, so we should get going." He heard a rustle before a series of other noises followed after, a loud thud being one of them, as he could only wonder why, but as quickly as the noise came, a somewhat flustered Ichigo appeared out the shoji door, ready and in full attire for a festival. He wore a navy blue yukata that had a golden pattern of fireworks on the bottom left. It contrasted nicely with his bright orange hair, but still made him look like quite the looker, even though he had looks to spare when he wore normal clothing as well. His own thoughts lingered, thinking that the orange head would make any woman swoon, and if he did join the Shiba clan, he would most likely have suitors lined up, ready at any given moment for their prey. His musing was cut short as he remembered the loud thud from earlier and had to cut his own fantasy short. "Ichigo, what was that noise?" The ex-Shinigami Daiko shifted nervously in his place as he seemed to scan his own surroundings looking for an answer, only to find none, and settled to look at the ground, which for some reason was much more interesting than the Shiba head at the moment. "I fell." The question mark did not go unnoticed, but Rimter said nothing, opting to let the young man keep it to himself since it really wasn't anything of great importance. Ichigo had to thank every god he could think of, along with the Spirit King, that the Raven Head hadn't pried further. After all, it's not like he could go ahead and say, "Oh sorry, I just happened to be meditating with my Zanpakuto spirits when you arrived, so I was startled and almost tripped, but don't worry, nothing of grand importance." Sure, like that would sound logical for someone that, as far as everyone else knew, did not have a Zanpakuto, let alone two. So he was really grateful when the Shiba curiosity didn't act up and was able to get free. Ichigo felt a gaze being directed towards him and turned to look at the Shiba head. He was staring rather intently, and for that Ichigo could not avoid lifting an eyebrow. "What? No, I was just thinking how well Shiba clothing suits you." He flushed lightly at the comment but was quickly replaced by panic and soon after confusion, remembering something that Rimter himself had said and not finding it coherent with the two facts put together. "But I thought you said all these were gifts from other clans." Seeing the orange head's confusion, he shook his head trying to prove his point, arms crossed over his chest, almost like if he were scolding a child, but still held the patience to hold his deception and explain. "We also store cloths that we've outgrown or no longer use. Take that yukata for example, it used to be mine some time back." Ichigo took in the information as he understood the logic behind it, since it really wasn't wise to leave useless clothing at the back of a closet. He was satisfied with the answer, but still couldn't help feeling a small bit of shock thanks to the fact that was revealed at the end, being that the navy blue yukata was once the Shiba head's. He was brought from his thoughts when the raven head cleared his throat and motioned Ichigo to follow him into the halls and to the gate. They walked in silence all the way, a calm yet peaceful one that let the birds chirping be heard like a melodious tune. As they arrived at the gate, Haruka was already there, hands at her waist and a scowl on her face. "You're late." Wataru only gave an apologetic smile as he returned his gaze to the orange head that was looking for something that both Shibas had no clue as to what. They were all shocked when Ichigo almost fell face first upon having force being applied in the hug he was suddenly grasped into. The orange head looked down to see a mop of black hair and more than anything the tight embrace the boy had on his own leg. "Hey Wataru-chan, I was just wondering where you were." As that question was answered, the two Shibas were finally able to notice how kind and open Ichigo happened to be with a little boy, and upon closer inspection, they also discovered Wataru's wide smile. "I'm glad you'll come to the festival with us, Ichi-nai. We can play games and eat takoyaki or some manju and okay, just calm down, we'll have some fun together, K." The boy just nodded rather earnestly, letting go of Ichigo's leg only to grab onto his hand, pulling him towards the gate and making him walk, the two Shibas right behind. As they finally caught up, they all set into a peaceful and cheerful stroll through the halls of what Ichigo noticed was the old Sirite. It was certainly an eye-opener to see the majestic Sirite he knew being so small and barely being built. He looked curiously at every single detail, finding it pretty interesting, and seeing how even so much into the past with everything being a smaller version, it was still a maze. As they arrived at the border of where the Sirite ended, the street started to look livelier with many people and stands all in happy cheers. "Let's go to eat some treats, Ichi-nai." Ichigo looked down to look at the small boy having an excited expression in place. He looked like he would burst with happiness, and this brought a happy expression in place as he gave a warm smile in return before he nodded and replying with a soft and barely audible okay, letting himself be dragged into the many stands and sea of people, not even having time to glance back to see if the other two Shibas were following. About an hour later, Ichigo was dead tired thanks to the fact that he didn't have a moment to spare between stand and stand, having to keep up with the little boy's excitement and being careful not to overexert himself, afraid that he would have a relapse or something worse. So when Haruka came behind him with an expression of sympathy in place and a hint of amusement telling him she would take over for a while, he was more than thankful. Once he got out of the crowd, he went to sit down on a bench that just so happened to have a view towards a small riverbank. He let out a shaky sigh before rolling his shoulders backwards, trying to get the soreness off and somewhat relax. Ichigo was surprised when the Shiba head all of a sudden appeared out of nowhere and sat down beside him with a sake jug in hand. "You're awfully relaxed in a crowd." Rimter glanced to look at him with a hint of confusion in place, mildly shocked that Ichigo was the one to initiate the conversation and not him. "What do you mean?" "Well, you're a captain and the Shiba head to boot. Wouldn't you be recognized or something?" This brought even more confusion onto the raven head, and Ichigo had to make a double take when the other seemed actually curious as to what Ichigo was talking about. After all, he never had that problem, no one did. "We aren't celebrities, at least not yet that I know of." Sure, say the name of any of the 5 great noble houses and anyone would know them, but actually recognizing the members of a clan or the Gate 13. Ichigo looked curiously at this, wanting to know more information of this time so that he could have more ammo when needed. Every piece of information was valuable. Seeing this, the Shiba head couldn't help but break into a smile and continue with his lecture, liking the idea of the orange head being so interested in the noble life. Every single noble family is registered into the Central 46 records, but they still haven't gone as deep as to write the exact amount of members, names or relations in between them. The 5 great noble houses are a bit more monitored, but since the great noble houses are relatively new, there still isn't a precise record. Take the Shiba clan for example, they know the name of the head, which is me, they know I'm captain of Squad 10, and also the fact that I was once married and that I have children, but they don't know how many children, genders or any of that. Rimter gave a pensive nod, deciding that giving more internal information wasn't that bad of an idea before looking back at Ichigo that was engulfed completely in the conversation, interest and fascination written all over his face, even if history was never one of his favorites. The family registers for the noble families are being integrated at the end of this year. The Central 46 is tired of having everything so lax and want to start having control even on us. Of course, this doesn't mean we're going to sit back and let them do what they want. It's our clan after all. I imagine that the clans are going to do anything they want before the register, right? This made a sort of malicious yet playful laugh erupt from the Shiba head, knowing where Ichigo was going with that sole question and not in the least offended by the fact that he and all the other clan heads were being accused of doing underhanded stuff. "Well, you could say, I mean anyone would, though I wasn't planning on doing anything until like 3 days ago." The new revelation brought newfound curiosity into the orange head. He glanced to look at the raven head to find his wide smug smirk that just wrote danger all over it. He gulped, trying not to look nervous and failing miserably as he tried to choke out the words and find out what the Shiba head was plotting. "ANWH, what is your plan?" The older man's smirk widened if possible before he got close to Ichigo's ear and opened his mouth to give his answer, which was apparently very secretive. Forcing you into the Shiba family. This made Ichigo scowl, throwing his previous nerves away as if they never existed in the first place. He turned to look at the raven head, planning on throwing a fit and giving him a reproach about how he had previously said it was Ichigo's choice to make and that he wouldn't force him, and now he was doing the opposite. But when he met with sad green eyes he stopped, previous feelings muted and trying to form a sentence together, having no luck whatsoever. Ichigo felt bad and looked at the dirt-made road the bench happened to be on, trying to get his thoughts in order, even if he finally knew his answer. He felt the silence but didn't feel uncomfortable as both versions of his Zangetsu seemed to give him strength from his inner world, encouraging him to look up again and face his problems like a man he was. Don't look back. The sole sentence brought the Shiba's attention onto the orange head that was looking into the river bank with determination obviously reflected in his amber eyes. All of a sudden amber met green as a staring contest commenced, not even stopping when Ichigo opened his mouth to give out an answer that just so happened to surprise the Shiba. You won't have to force me. 2. Erina, where's Ichinai and Chichu? Haruka glanced down to look at the little curious boy that now held a less excited face and was more inclined to worry. This brought a certain confusion to her, but decided not to inquiry just yet and first answer the boy. Well, Ichigo looked pretty tired, so he's resting for now, and Chichu, well, he must be somewhere. This seemed to alleviate the young Shiba's worry even if just a little, but he still held apprehension that one would think impossible for a boy his age. What's wrong with Teru-chan? Ichinai looks sad when he's alone, that's why I don't want to leave him by himself. Haruka saddened, realizing she hadn't even noticed and how the small boy caught onto Ichigo's real feelings when they hadn't even seen them. She softened up, hoping more than ever that Ichigo would stay with him so that he wouldn't stay alone any longer. She looked down when Wataru's voice brought her attention as she silently listened to the boy that looked close to tears. I always play and talk with Ichinai when he's alone and I really like to spend time with him. I don't want him to leave. The eldest of the two broke into a small smile and kneeled down next to the young raven head to give him a hug, trying to convey her understanding before standing up once more, holding him in her arms. How about we go and look for Ichigo and Chichu so that we can look at the lanterns together? At this he only nodded, not wanting to say anything but gaining comfort by Haruka's hug, but most of all her steady presence. After some time, it could be said that they had been walking around the stands looking around for what seemed like half an hour when it had only been around 10 minutes. Wataru was starting to get impatient and Haruka was having a hard time keeping him calm when all of a sudden something orange caught her attention and she was finally able to see her target, which happened to be sitting right next to her father. Look, Wataru-chan, it's Ichigo and Chichu. Said boy beamed with excitement at seeing that Ichigo wasn't alone. They were about to call out in unison to give them a surprise when all of a sudden Ichigo's steady voice surprised them. You won't have to force me. Both stood frozen, not because of what Ichigo had said, no, they didn't even understand the meaning of those words. What surprised them, however, was their stupid father starting a scene. Are you serious? At this Ichigo hesitated, but he slowly but surely nodded, giving the other an unimaginable relief and tranquil. The Shiba head stood up and pulled Ichigo into a heartwarming hug, which the orange head had no idea to react to, only stood there frozen in place. I'm glad. Once Haruka saw her father's reaction, everything clicked into place and she couldn't help but let out an equally happy grin spread on her face. She looked down at Wataru that had a face of confusion and knelt down next to him, getting close enough to murmur something in his ear without being heard. I think Ichigo is going to stay in the manor with us. That sole sentence brought a goofy smile onto the toddler as he glanced back to look at Ichigo's panicked expression as he was hugged and decided to help him out, letting his presence known. Chichu, let go of Ichinai. He doesn't like your hug. The two men finally noticed the new company promoting Rimter to grin widely at his family and Ichigo to blush a light pink in embarrassment. The older of the two ran off to his two children to glop them into a tight hug, letting Ichigo take a break from the overenthusiastic Shiba. My family has grown once more. Get off, Chichu. I love you to Haru-chan. Don't call me that. Ichigo smiled sadly at the scene, finding so much resemblance to his own crazy father and how they would share their love. He was so embraced in memories of the past that he didn't notice that he was being stared at by the three Shibas until a tiny hand was placed on his leg, making him jump slightly and look at the source of the intrusion to his memories. He was met with the big green eyes of little Wataru as he glanced down at the boy that held curiosity-filled eyes and a smile as wide as possible. Ichinai, thank you for staying with us. I always wanted to have a big brother. Those words stung deep into his very core, words that made his eyes water even against his own will. It was more than anything remains from a memory that made this happen, not only thanks to the little boy's words, it was the very emotions that were conveyed so much like that memory that triggered the phenomenon. Ichigai, when I grow up I want to be a Shinigami like you. Said person could not suppress a chuckle as he ruffled a small tuft of burnt orange hair so much like his mother and gave a warm smile that made the boy very happy since his Ichigo was just so hard to make smile. Ichigo thought about the boy's father, thinking it was so rare that the orange head wanted to be a Shinigami with his father being who he was. I think your father would be really disappointed if you didn't become a Quincy. This brought a pout to the boy's face as he crossed his arms over his chest, trying to imitate Ichigo's signature scowl to the best of his abilities, even though it didn't look one bit menacing. But you're a Shinigami and a Quincy. The sold sentence brought a certain realization to mind as he just froze to think about what the little boy had said, but thought nothing of it as he found a simple yet non-convincing explanation. I'm just weird that way. But even if you're weird I still want you as a big brother. Ichigo. The soft voice brought him from his musing as he glanced at the two older Shibas that held worry etched onto their faces. He felt something wet and brought a hand to his cheek to see a lonely tear had betrayed him and showed his true despair. Ichigo cleaned off the tear as he gave a sad melancholic smile, trying to alleviate the worry the others felt for him and also convince himself that he was okay. This seemed to calm them if only a little bit as Haruka tried to smile back while holding a bag up to show the other three. I bought 2 lanterns a little while ago with some brushes so that we can put a name and set them free. Haruka gave Ichigo a lantern and a brush which had ink, ready to use, and the orange head couldn't help but glance down at the small paper thing in his hands as he thought of when was the last time he had set one off himself. The orange head looked at the 2 Shiba siblings that had left in a hurry to the shore, lantern ready and lit up about to place it on the clear water. He saw the Shiba head behind him and couldn't help but look curiously while staring into his green eyes, not really expecting the other to speak up since his gaze seemed so distant. My wife died in labor. Wataru was born healthy thanks to her sacrifice that was about 25 years ago. Ichigo kept on staring at the man, not really wanting to speak up and ruin the peaceful moment that decided to suddenly bless them. Rimter really didn't care when the orange head decided to stay quiet and he actually thought of it as a sign of goodwill since he was actually listening. I'd imagine you've lost many people and just because you joined our family it means you won't lose any more people but at least you won't be lonely. The head was quite surprised when Ichigo let out an annoyed huff of breath and turned back to the river while speaking up, voice steady yet barely audible. I bet it's a nuisance to take in someone like me. Maybe but let me tell you, I happen to have a soft spot for cripples, bastards and broken things. Ichigo scoffed, looking back at the raven head with a tug of a smile lingering dangerously on his lips even though he was trying to give an annoyed scowl while failing badly. So now I'm a broken thing. Who said you were a broken thing? Maybe you're a cripple or bastard. You yourself chose one. Ichigo didn't respond, thinking back to the lantern and who he should place it for. He thought of his friends, family, comrades, subordinates and many others that had died throughout all his life. He thought back to the boy with burnt orange hair and how he had met his demise, his parents, Orihime and Ryu dying while trying to protect the boy and failing miserably. Ichigo only arriving in time to hear Ryu's final words to him that even now resounded in his very core, words that came out in pauses as he coughed blood and struggled to breath, but Ryu was still able to convey his disgust against the whole masterminds that had created the hell they were living in. Beat the bastards and remember us in the end. The words were more than enough for Ichigo to understand that Ryu didn't want revenge, he wanted Ichigo to win, to survive, and that was what he had done till the bitter end. But now he was not in that time, the people that had died had yet to even be born. He had time. So after a lot of thinking and being in a memory-induced state, he was finally able to decide on what to write on the lantern. So he grabbed a brush and wrote the 2 kanji letters that meant the start of his new life and lit the small lantern making way to the shore and kneeling down to place it on the water. Meanwhile Rimter had been seeing the whole thing, never interrupting or calling out, knowing it would be better to leave it at that and let Ichigo do as he pleased and just watch on the sidelines. So when Ichigo started walking towards the shore and kneeling down like a little boy about to play in the water, he couldn't help but follow behind silently to see the name of the person Ichigo cherished enough to write on the lantern. But what he saw amazed him and at the same time made him proud as Ichigo finally placed the lantern in the water, letting it float and make the kanji visible. Then Keiko passed. Chapter 4. 50 years later, chirping noises resounded through the morning breeze, the cool wind rustled the trees, along with the chimes that just so happened to be hung on the hallway. The noise made its way to ears of a curled-up figure in a futon, groaning lightly and cuddling further into the covers as his dreamless sleep was disrupted. The noise happened again, this time added by a set of footsteps as they made way towards the shoji doors of the slumbering person. The doors were sprung open with force enough to make a loud clang, but even that didn't wake the curled-up figure. Wake up Ichi-nai, stop being lazy. Chichu is calling so hurry up, come on. The tuft of orange hair popped out of the covers as amber eyes were barely visible, still glazed thanks to the sleep-induced state he was in mere seconds ago. 5 more minutes. The other which had gone with the purpose of waking up the orange head pouted, arms crossed over his chest in evident disagreement. Do you want me to call Haruka? This made Ichigo react, jumping out of the warm confinements of the futon and rushing into the closet to get changed. Being wide awake even though it was relatively early, he yelled from the other room, hassled in changing clothing, but sure that his alarm clock would hear him. What does Shichu want at 6 in the morning? The smaller boy only shifted in his place, thoughtful with a finger resting on his chin in a very pensive way trying to find an answer. He shrugged to himself once he couldn't find one, and seeing as the orange head could not hear a shrug, he decided to voice out his thoughts. He didn't say. Having already finished changing, the oldest of the Shiba siblings came out to join the youngest, wearing a simple forest green kimono with a black haori on top since it was pretty chilly for being beginnings of January. Ichigo ruffled the black locks of the boy, earning himself an annoyed glare even if his hand wasn't pushed away. Let's go Wataru-chan, wouldn't want Haru to get mad because we're late now, would we? Seeing the boy, which now looked like a 13-year-old, nod, he began to walk down the halls of the Shiba manor towards the dining room, knowing full well that early family meetings would always be held with breakfast before the Shiba head would have to go to his captain duties. Once they arrived to the dining room, the playful smile that was on Wataru's face disappeared, being replaced by a frown thanks to the man that just so happened to be sitting next to his father. The youngest of the Shibas glanced up to look at his elder brother, seeing an unreadable expression etched onto his face that just made him shudder, thinking how fake the orange head besides him now seemed to be. He winced when he noticed the sharp glare that the intruder sent his way and proceeded to enter the room as quietly as possible and sit next to his sister, which just so happened to be scowling rather fiercely. Wataru glanced at his father once more to see a very fake smile on his face as he tried to be a good host for a man he clearly disliked, and he couldn't agree more. The man looked old and had gray hair that reached a little bit over mid-back, his piercing black eyes bore holes into his very being, and he couldn't help but quiver under the gaze. He would be eternally grateful that his dear brother went to the rescue, interrupting the stare with a polite greeting. It's nice to see you again, Genji-sama. No one missed the clench of his teeth as he murmured the sole sentence as he gave a shallow bow, but even as he did, Ichigo's unemotional expression never wavered, in fact it hardened, getting locked between locks and codes, never to be let free in front of someone Ichigo wasn't comfortable with. The reaction given in response was enough to make their blood boil, but of course they could do nothing but endure it as the old man seemed to spit out the words. At least one of your snotty brats has enough manners to manage a somewhat proper greeting. Gen scoffed as he rolled his eyes and took a glance at the Shiba head, which for the record had hands balled in fists at his lap, knuckles as white as snow and getting wider by the second. And you're no better. I don't know why my brother even bothered to leave the head of this clan to a failure like you. This seemed to get a reaction from Haruka that had stayed silent the whole time, trying not to throw a tantrum, but failing miserably in the end. Don't speak that way of Chichu. Seeing that the Shiba daughter would end up doing something she would later regret, Ichigo strode to her side and placed a hand in hers, trying to make her calm down and get some comfort by his presence. Gee, look at that. The Shibaheim is a disgrace to the family at this rate. I think you should leave, Jai-san. The old man glanced wide-eyed at the interruption, seeing that the Shiba head, which had wanted to avoid conflict from the beginning, had suddenly decided he had enough. You've overstayed your welcome. The older man scoffed once more as he stood up and strode out towards the wide-open shoji door and into the hall, giving a glance back to glare at the Shiba main family and then just leave like if he had done nothing wrong and Rimter had been the one to do badly. Once the man was out of earshot, Haruka was finally able to let out her frustration as she yelled out her thoughts for everyone to know. I just hate that shitty geezer. They all couldn't agree more with Haruka, and Rimter would have voiced out his thoughts in front of the man if he wasn't scared what the Shiba elder would do to his children if he pissed off the man. You were awfully quiet, Wataru-chan. Once Ichigo had spoken up, the Shiba head noticed that what the orange head had said was accurate and weird at the same time, so he glanced to look at his youngest, seeing that he still had a deep frown, and as the curiosity beat him, he raised an eyebrow to inquiry. Your brother's right, you know. It's weird that you didn't start offending the bastard the moment you saw him. Wataru just crossed his arms over his chest, scowl very prominent on his face as he had a perfect teacher to copy from. I didn't want Ichi-nai or Chichu to get in trouble again. Yes, that's true. He remembered the times that the Shiba Council was convinced by none other than Shiba Jen that Rimter had done an awful job raising them and how it was necessary to take action. In the end, they sent Ichigo to some extracurricular noble classes so that he would give a good example for the other two, and that had given the young Shiba a sort of regret because he had bothered his Ichi-nai, so now he had tried to keep his mouth shut and not say a word. Ichigo on the other hand exceeded the elder's expectations. He had passed his lessons with flying colors, acting as proper and educated as a high-class noble would act and making Shiba Jen shut up and not bother them in a long while. Of course, good things never last long. So when Wataru suddenly put a sorry face and inclined his head slightly, Ichigo couldn't help but ruffle the short black locks of the little brother he had never hoped to have but more than anything was grateful for. It wasn't your fault, I already told you so, who cares? We were able to shut the council too, so we ended up winning. Wataru was able to muster up a small smile as he sat back in his seat, everyone else mirroring his actions, as some servants came in to place an early breakfast on the table for the Shiba family to enjoy. As the air lightened up thanks to Jen leaving, Haruka was able to relax and muster up her more cheerful demeanor, trying to make what was left of their time be somewhat enjoyable. "So Chichu, why did you wake us up so early and summon up a family meeting?" The Shiba head seemed confused for a second before he remembered what he wanted to tell his children, before the bother had appeared. "Oh yeah, I forgot all about it because he came unannounced." Ichigo scoffed, not being able to agree more but still wanting to show his displeasure. He really hated his uncle. "Well, I have some news to share with you all, but first I want to ask my dearest elder son something." Ichigo glanced at his father rather nervously, even now he felt weird referring to the man as a father and with respect, but he had slowly but surely gotten used to it, only rarely slipping up and screwing up, so now that said man was actually referring to him as his son, which was the story they had created, that now seemed more of a true than a lie. He couldn't help but feel apprehension. "How are your studies in the academy coming along?" This seemed to gain everyone's attention as all eyes were on the orange head that now looked overwhelmed by the sudden attention. He really hated this moment. "I would like to know to Ichi-nai, even if you really don't like to talk about yourself, I've been kinda curious." Haruka nodded at this, wholeheartedly agreeing with Wataru in how Ichigo wasn't really talkative and how they knew mostly nothing of his time in the Shinigami Academy. Why the question, Chichu? "Well, I received a call from Yamamoto Dono the other day to talk about out-of-work business. Apparently he wants to know your opinion on his pride that happens to be the Shinigami Academy, and since you just so happen to be a student and are also lauded for being a prodigy, I think you could give valuable advice." Ichigo shifted nervously in his place, trying to find a way out of the conversation if it was the last thing he did. After all, what could he say? "The academy is boring because I already know all this. I just entered the academy to become a Shinigami and join the Gate 13 to stop a future war." Not something he could comment on. "I think it's interesting." Rimter glared at his eldest son, thinking how he was not being honest and was just trying to avoid the topic altogether. This was part of the reason he had decided to take the problem before leaving for his squad. He would get a proper answer before sharing the news. "I think that was more of a question than an affirmation. The thing is, Rimter-san, Ichigo was cut off rather abruptly by a slap on the head by none other than Rimter himself. He had a menacing gaze that would have made Ichigo quaver had he not lived in a war and more than anything held a ting of disappointment. "Kichu, not Rimter-san." The orange head nodded in understanding, feeling bad he had slipped and called the man by his name when he had stopped doing so decades ago. He was about to keep up with his previous thought when all of a sudden he was interrupted again by the hand the Shiba head had suddenly raised. "I already know more than enough to not need your answer, Ichigo. There was a meeting for teachers to share their opinions with each other in the presence of the Satechu, or in this case principal of the academy, and a small detail came to light which the principal could no longer ignore." Ichigo looked down, finding more interest in the folds of his kimono than the current conversation. He knew what was to come, and he seriously couldn't blame anyone but himself. After all, it was his fault he was so bad at suppressing his knowledge in the Shinigami arts and not attract attention. "The teachers mentioned how talented you were and how bored you seemed to be in their classes, so they wanted Yamamoto Dono to take matters in the situation. They decided to place you in advanced class, but with a higher year." The orange head stayed silent as he was too surprised to even speak up at the moment. After all, he was not expecting that. Actually, it was the last thing on his mind. "So you're telling me Yamamoto Dono decided to solve this problem by raising me into another year?" Rimter looked uncaring as he nodded, doing so like if it were a normal everyday thing for a young Shinigami student and not some bizarre anomaly. So now that Ichigo understood, the raven head couldn't help but give a warm proud smile before speaking up. "The teachers debated on which grade to place you in and decided you advanced to 5th. That was something he was not expecting, and from the sudden drop of chopsticks that was heard to his side was anything to go by, neither did his two siblings. Did they realize the difference between 1 and 5? The Shiba head raised an eyebrow at a weird question, thinking how stupid it was, but not really wanting to point it out clearly and embarrass the orange head. "Are you saying the Satechu doesn't know how to count?" Ichigo really wanted to throw his hands up and yank his hair off, they were taking it too lightly. It was as if his father thought it was normal to jump 4 years like that, even though he was supposed to be a normal soul, even if he was anything but normal. The orange head was brought back from his musing when Haruka decided to speak up rather excitedly, almost as if she was the one going up in terms of years. "Stop breeding, Ichigo, it's not a bad thing." Rimter seemed to take advantage of Haruka's point and join in, making the orange head feel like if he had done something wrong and was being scolded for it. "Bear's right. It's a big responsibility since you'll have to work harder than your peers, but at the same time it's a privilege, so don't look at it like it's a bad thing." Ichigo sighed, apparently accepting defeat and embracing the situation. After all, it wasn't a bad thing so per se, it's just that he didn't want to gain attention, and now that would be pretty much impossible even though his family name and hair made it hard as it was. Therefore, instead of mopping on, he decided to think of it as something positive. At least he wouldn't get bored much. Oh, and one last thing, Ichi. Said person scowled before looking at the one at fault for his expression, honestly hating the nickname, but not being able to do a thing as he responded through gritted teeth. What? Rimter in response grinned, liking how Ichigo actually responded to the name, even though he was being victim to a murderous gaze at the moment. More paperwork came in yesterday night. Might as well take it with you before leaving for the academy, that way I won't have to send it later with a servant. Ichigo groaned, earnestly wanting to forget about the blasted papers and throw them in the trash, feelings that were very much understood by the Shiba head, as he was also prey to the same sheets. They both hated those papers, which were as surprising as it was the Shiba Council's doing. The reason that Ichigo and Rimter understood each other on the hatred of those measly papers was because only they knew the content of those ink-scribbled sheets they had kept a secret and would like to keep it that way. After all, the duo did not want Haruka or Wataru to find out the papers were none other than marriage proposals. Proposals that had to be rejected and sent back. Papers that came in mountains at times that kept you busy for a long while, as Ichigo had found out 30 years ago when the feral attacks had started and he had discovered their existence. What's all that? The Shiba head jumped from his place, being honestly surprised at the sudden presence that seemed to appear out of nowhere. He scurried to rapidly grab a handful of scattered papers to try to hide them in an open drawer and failing miserably as his panicked state didn't let him think calmly. Rimter was wide-eyed as he twitched nervously in his seat, finally looking up at the intruder and feeling a dread at the pit of his stomach. After all, this person was too perspective to be true, though he rarely showed it. Ichigo, didn't we agree that you would call me Chichu? Ichigo in response just rolled his eyes before sitting down on the free chair and looking rather seriously at the raven head, giving an unemotional expression that didn't calm Rimter whatsoever. Chichu, what is this? The orange head lifted his hand to reveal a paper he had grabbed when the Shiba head was panicking, trying to give the most menacing gaze he could muster, which happened to be really murderous, and pointing at his very visible name on the sheet. In response, said person started to look around to notice the stack on the floor he had failed to notice earlier, cursing at his stupidity, but at the same time accepting fault. Well, that happens to be a paper which, happens to have your name on it. The newest of the Shiba's eyebrow twitched as his rage started to seep out, even if his face held no expression at all. And my name also happened to be on at least half of these papers. Well, it's nothing you should worry about, Ichigo, I'll take care of it, it's my responsibility. Ichigo looked at the raven head, seeing no sign of his previous nervousness in sight and having a determined expression that also happened to have a small hint of sorry, so small that you actually had to stare into the deep green and be very perceptive to notice. Therefore, when the orange head noticed that the Shiba head did not want to tell him directly, he stood up and grabbed a new brush with a jar of ink, opening it and placing it on the clean side of the desk before sitting back on the chair and starting to read the paper. What are you doing, Ichigo, didn't you hear me? It really isn't your problem. The orange head looked up from his paper to look directly into green eyes, surprising the other as the amber eyes seemed to shine brightly and shut up rather abruptly. If it wasn't my problem before, then now it is. Getting back his ground as a superior person, his gaze hardened as he spoke up sternly and trying to clearly show it was not up for debate. These marriage proposals started to show up because you are Shiba, the surname I gave you, so it is not your problem, let me handle it and go back home. The Shiba head was firm in his words, but the moment Ichigo stood up rather suddenly and looked at him from above, since he was still seated, he just could not maintain the determined glare he previously had. It turned into my problem when I entered the Shiba family. I accepted the responsibility that came with that name, so I knew what I was getting into. Besides, thanks to these papers you always come home late. Wataru misses you, and so does Haruka, so just let me help you and stop being stubborn, Chichu. That had been the first time that Ichigo had called him Chichu in private without having to remind him of it, and even if it was the day he really involved Ichigo into the clan's duties and he really hated himself for that, he would never want to forget that memorable occasion. He had felt a happiness incomparable with that sole word at the end of the scolding, so it was always a good memory, even if it came with a reminder of those proposals. Proposals that came like an open faucet at times and other times like a small leak. He really would have cursed the elders Jen to the end of the world for introducing his children to the noble world and practically stating that they were open for marriage. So now that Ichigo helped him out with a great portion of the papers, he had free time to spend with his family, even if just occasionally. What are those papers anyway? The Shiba head glanced nervously to look at Haruka, feeling a déjà vu all over again. He was never good at lying, and lying to his children came as an even more challenge. Well, there, practice paperwork, you could say. Haruka and Rimter turned to look at the orange head, the nervous father being relieved Ichigo had interfered, and the Shiba princess glad that she was getting an answer. What do you mean practice paperwork? An important part in a Shinigami life is to, as ridiculous as it sounds, know how to fill out paperwork, so I asked Chichu to lend me some of his so that I can study real formats and not just the ones we see in the academy. The Shiba head would be forever grateful that his eldest son somehow knew how to think on his feet, in other words, knew precisely what to do in any given situation in the blink of an eye. Haruka seemed to be content with the answer and let the situation slide, going back to eat when she noticed her favorite side dish was finished. Ah. Who ate my sweet and sour pork? She glared at the two men only to receive two terrified expressions, the Shiba men shaking their head rather earnestly to try and avoid the wrath they knew the Shiba head would most likely have if they had eaten it. All three turned to look at the seat they knew the remaining family member would be seated, only to find it empty, along with the plates nearest to him, with the exception of one half-eaten piece of Haruka's precious dish. The two men seeing this, stumbled to stand up and quickly ran out of the room, wanting to get out of the room as fast as they could, both going in different directions, wanting to get as far away as possible, but still waiting for the explosion they knew would come. Wataru. 3. The loud stomp of steps through the hallways of the manor made the wood crack as the culprit of said noise ran, scurrying over to his destination with a stack of papers neatly carried in his arms. The man was panting, sweat dripping down his bald head to fall off at the end of his chin, obviously having been running for a long time or just being unused to such exercise. He hurried over with his strong, muscled build, trying to get the papers as fast as possible to the one awaiting them, striding with such posture that showed how much of a proud man he was, even though he was obviously a servant, his pitch-black mustache radiating the source of his pride and joy rather intently. Ichigo-sama. Ichigo-sama, I brought the last stack. He slid to a stop outside a door that was slightly open, juggling the papers in one hand to try and open the half-lid shoji door by himself, only to stop when the door opened on its own. Oh, thank you Kaganahiko. But you know, I could have gone to fetch them myself. The man now named Kaganahiko shook his head, obviously disagreeing with the orange head and beaming with energy to try and show Ichigo that he had not been bothered one bit by carrying the paperwork for his dear Ichigo-sama from the 10th squad barracks to the manor. It was my pleasure. After all, you're leaving for the academy any minute now. Ichigo gave a smile in response, knowing that the man would never bother to whine or anything remotely similar, just like the twins that once guarded the Shiba Manor in his own time. He actually secretly wondered if they were somehow related. The name sounds awfully similar. The man gave a deep bow before straightening up once more in his proud posture, looking slightly down to see the orange head in the eye, since he was smaller than the bald man. Well then, I'll take my leave. Have a good day Ichigo-sama, and I hope that your time at the academy is satisfactory as always. The Shiba nodded before giving a small smile, gesture that was very much appreciated by any and all members of the household, since Ichigo rarely if ever showed emotion, he usually maintained a blank expression, not void just blank or serious. The servant rushed off once again and when he was out of sight, Ichigo turned to look at his small amount of stuff he was planning on taking to the academy. He had his satchel with some new clothing he had just got for Christmas courtesy of Haruka, which were compassed by some new training robes, since he usually ripped his pretty easily when training on his own, and a warm yet simple haori, perfect for the chilly weather of the season. The orange head was obviously taking the just arrived papers and most importantly the black-hilted Zanpakuto that was neatly placed on the wooden sword rack he had on his long table. Ichigo strode to the end of the room to grab Zangetsu and examine the blade, unsheathing it beforehand and looking at the small emblem that had been inscribed on the flat side of the steel. It was the Shiba crest, marking the blade as Shiba along with the wielder himself, making the simple sword 100 times its original worth. Rimter had insisted that Ichigo's sword be marked as Shiba and by default himself, saying how the blade had protected his precious son from numerous dangerous situations and that it should be cherished as such. And of course Ichigo couldn't decline because it was so true and he could never hope to repay both Zangetsus though Zangetsu Shiro had bitched all week in his mind about how painful it had been and that it had taken him incredible self-control to not burn the swordsmith that happened to be engraving the emblem. I wonder if I can use Zangetsu in sparring now that I'm a 5th year. He really wondered, and that was only because it was prohibited to use Zanpakuto or Asauchi as they were called before having the soul of the Shinigami in them that came from outside of the academy in his 1st year, so he had to leave Zan in his room while he used a stupid training sword in class. It was real hell. He hoped that now that he was a 5th year he could take his partner for a run inside classes and not just when he would train on his own. He smiled once more at his blade and sheathed it back in its black sheath, slipping it in his obi and moving to grab his satchel and place it on his back before reaching for the stupid, annoying, hellish paperwork. You leaving already? Ichigo would have been startled by the rather sudden appearance of his youngest sister if it weren't because it was quite hard to sneak up on him since he knew at every moment of the day when someone was close by, and of course he had obviously noticed Haruka making way towards his room a long time ago. Yeah, I have to get my new timetables and check in with Yamamoto Dono so that he can tell me all about my new classes, so I want to get there as soon as possible. Haruka gave a soft sigh and looked down, thinking that she really hated when Ichigo left for the academy and how lonely and empty the manor turned without his steady yet small presence. Would you come back? Soon. Ichigo gave a soft smile upon seeing how the usually fiery Shiba princess was looking rather depressed and sad at the fact he was leaving. He really hated making his new family and old family and anyone dear for him on that matter sad. Don't worry, I'll come back once I have a free day or in the holidays. She seemed to process this before thinking that it was the best she would be able to get out of him, and also the fact that Ichigo could not come home very often thanks to his studies and that she shouldn't be so selfish. Alright, and I hope you make friends this time. The orange head rolled his eyes, thinking how he would give anything up to find a single person that didn't want to befriend him because he was Shiba, talented, or just because he was good looking. Well, that's what everyone else said about him. Yeah, well, it's kinda hard when you can't even be yourself. Haruka gave a chuckle upon realizing how hard Ichigo had it when he was expected to be a role model for the rest of the clan and that he certainly would have problems to find someone that would approach him for being himself and not his name. Well, that is a dilemma you have there. Ichigo gave a low scoff, really wanting to point out how it was more of a dilemma and that he didn't mind being alone but thought against it, knowing the Shiba Haim would never accept something like that. So instead he walked past Hien into the hallway, glancing back to look at her one last time before leaving and trying to give her a small smile as a goodbye. I'll see you later. It ras I. 1-3. Okay, let me get this straight. You're telling me Yamaji decided to put a first year in a higher year and that this first year just so happens to be in our class that may I mention is advanced 5th year. That's exactly what I said, Shu. The first person that had spoken stopped on his tracks, well aware that he was obstructing the traffic in the hallways of the academy, but not even caring as he glanced back to look at his white-haired friend. You have got to be kidding me, Ju, what is the old man thinking? Said person, which happened to be called as Ju, shook his head, being as serious as possible, and hopping his brown-haired best friend wouldn't throw a tantrum in the middle of the halls like he did so many times before when chasing girls. I don't know, but maybe. Kamraku Shunsui and Ukitake Chkshurm, you are being called by the headmaster. You, now known to be an abbreviation of Chkshurm, stopped mid-sentence to look at the person which interrupted his opinion on the new interesting rumor, only to find the men's dorm supervisor looking at them with his usual uncaring face. He gave a shallow bow to the man, knowing that it was needed even when the man wasn't bothered a bit by the lack of respect. Good day, sir. You said sensei was calling both of us. The older man nodded before flickering his gaze back to the other boy now known to be Kamraku Shunsui. Said person squirmed under the supervisor's gaze as he wanted more than anything to leave that very moment. I hope you didn't get in trouble so soon, Kamraku. Me? Get in trouble? What makes you think that? Chkshurm gave out a sigh, knowing where the conversation was going, but not wanting to think about it as they needed to be somewhere else. So before the dorm supervisor or Shunsui could speak up once again, Chkshurm intervened, wanting to leave the discussion for later and appease his curiosity. Sorry sir, but we have to go. Bye. The white-haired boy ran off with a small pace of shumpo, knowing that it would be better to get away and not wait for a replay, and as such the reason as to why he currently had Shunsui grabbed by the collar of his white kozo too, dragging him to their destination, while throwing a deft ear to the protest and struggle the other was pulling. 3. I know you mentioned how there was no need for a guide on the first week, but I really insist, it will be easier to get up to date with your classes and the advanced material you may not know about. I appreciate the concern, Yamamoto Dono, but I prefer to go on my own. Yamamoto shook his head, unpleased by the insistence the young orange head had to be left on his own. When the teachers had mentioned the Shiba prodigy's antisocialness, he hadn't considered how grave the situation was, but now he could almost feel the denial the boy showed. Why are you so insistent, Ichigo? Said person never wavered in his neutral mask that showed nothing. Yamamoto had to give the boy props, he was good at hiding his thoughts and feelings in the outside, but of course he wasn't easily fooled and could feel the small apprehension the orange head's Ryatsu seeped out as he wanted to avoid the topic wholeheartedly, but knew he could not, and even more when he was locked in a gaze with the strongest Shinigami to have ever existed that now looked 100 times more frightening than the old man did in his own time. Well, it's not that I loathe the idea of being around people, it's just that, well, everyone tends to try and get near me just because of my family name or because the teachers consider me a prodigy, and that's not the best of people to be around. The black-haired man pondered over this, knowing perfectly well what the orange-haired prodigy meant and how annoying it could get to be with people that just wanted to ride on his name. He sighed, bringing a hand up to scrub his hardened features and see if he could do something about it, but found nothing whatsoever. He was quickly brought back to attention when said source of the problem stood up from his place on the zabuton 3 that was in front of himself, giving a bow out of respect more than anything, and straightening up again to look at Yamamoto in the eye. "Thank you for the thought, Yamamoto dono, but I'll be fine, so if you'll excuse me." The headmaster sighed again, apparently having been left with no ideas and not finding an excuse to make the orange head stay and see if his idiot of a student Shunsui would come around before the boy left so that he could push the new fifth year into the two boys' care, but as he found nothing he stood up and looked at Ichigo in the eyes, still surprised how the lad could look at him directly without at least flinching like everyone else did. He really liked that about the young Shiba. "Alright, you may leave." With another this time shallow bow, Ichigo strode out, silence echoing as not even his footstep resounded as he left the man's office and into the hallways, obviously leaving to his room and get everything ready since he now had a new timetable and thus, new material. Yamamoto on the other hand pinched the bridge of his nose as the last hope he had plumed down and the two fifth years didn't arrive in time. He wasn't looking forward to tell the Shiba captain that the plan of make the orange-haired prodigy a bit more social failed, but before he could even begin to fathom how depressed the man would be when word caught his ear the door was flung open, a scowling which was a rare sight Shunsui and a slightly guilty-looking Chikshurm came in. "Sorry sensei, we had a little problem." Said person groaned, already imagining what the delay would be about and judging by the two boys' expression not being far from the truth. He was pretty sure Shunsui had been up to no good again, but thought nothing of it as he was too focused on the matter at hand that had to be solved. "Never mind that I have a problem to think of right now, so you two aren't needed anymore." Shunsui's scowl seemed to worsen, not being in a good mood as he had been going through a shitty day and not wanting to take that as an answer. "You called us here Yamaji, so what's with not being needed?" The man turned to glare at the brown-haired boy, making him shudder under his gaze and being quite proud of it in the end. Yamamoto was about to retort again when an idea came to mind, an idea that may help his case and at the same time avoid an upset Shiba. "You know what, never mind what I said, I do have a job for you too and you might not like it, but I need you take an eye on someone." Chapter 5 Tick-tock. The pendulum kept its steady rhythm of left to right, never wavering in its strikes and not even hesitating to stop and wait for those that had been left behind. Tick-tock. It struck once more, keeping up with its never-ending dance of ticking and talking even as many men and women, Hollow, Shinigami, Quincy, Human, gave up on living and decided to stay shrouded in the shadows of the past, being left behind by the eternal tick of the unwavering clock. Tick-tock. The pendulum continued on its tracks, never looking into the past, never looking back, always stepping into the future, something he came to envy from the clock at some point in time, something he longed for as if it would stop the suffering that just seemed to increase as time flew by, time that for him had just suddenly stopped. Tick-tock. He hated that tick, he really detested the steady rhythm of time leaving him behind, but he knew more than anything that he just hated himself, something he had barely come to understand, something he had feared all along and was finally able to accept. Tick-tock. Mostly everyone would like to know when he had started to stay behind. They all knew he had just stopped, but when it had started they just couldn't decipher. They couldn't guess if it was when he first lost someone truly dear to him or if it had happened when the war had started to take a turn for the worst. Tick-tock. They never realized that his scowls and smiles were as fake as a nameless Zanpakuto being called a real one, but they didn't notice, no, more like they were unable to, because at some point in time Kurosaki Ichigo had just become a master at concealing his feelings. Tick-tock. Ichigo had actually thought of when he had started to hate the blasted tick of the clock, but the only conclusion that he could think of was that he just didn't know. He didn't know if it was the day that he had found Yuzu, Karen Ennis and coated in blood at his doorstep, half dead yet half alive. He didn't know if it was the day he had lost his dad, someone from his immediate family that had been there since the beginning, even if he had been goofing around most of time. He didn't know if it was the day he had lost the whole Ishida family in one night. He seriously didn't know. Tick-tock. That pendulum would someday make him go insane, he thought to himself, because the more he thought of the situation, the more he seemed prone to think he had not lost everyone, but rather the fact that he had basically failed to protect them, even if he had no fault whatsoever. Tick-tock. He really didn't know if the whimpers of pain and anguish triggered such a thing either, but he could still hear them so vividly as time went by, time that ticked and talked in a mocking way that just made the Oranjit cower more and more, by the screams and cries of his allies that just made the clock something to hate even more. Tick-tock. That noise he could so vividly hear even now, laughing at his incompetence of being there and making the yells, whimpers, cries, the tick so unbearable even in sleep, something that just seemed to drive him crazy even now. Something that just kept running amok through his head. Tick-tock. Thud. Pain was the first thing that he registered once he had been abruptly kicked out of his dream, pain that seemed unbearable at the moment, even if he just felt a dull twinge while trying to get on his feet from the cold wooden floor. He started to get up slowly while supporting himself by using the desk that was previously used as his pillow. He stayed quite to himself even as his inner thoughts ran amok with a sense of inner pain and memories that just made him silent in more than one way. Ow. He stood at his full height while groaning thanks to the slight pain. He gazed through the open window that had brought a gentle breeze into the room, making his tan-colored skin gain goosebumps from the chills that ran down his spine. He sighed, thinking how stupid it was of him for sleeping on the desk, but thought nothing of it right after when he realized how meaningless it was. He turned once more to look at the full-body mirror that was at his left, mirroring his disheveled form with slightly long orange locks that brushed lightly down his neck in such an unruly and messy manner that made him look like someone from the Rukongai when he was actually someone from such a high class. Many would be jealous. Ichigo sighed once more while running a hand through his slightly spiky locks to try and make them at least a little bit neater while failing graciously. He thinks nothing of it as he starts walking towards the bathroom that was attached to his room, only turning once to look at the silent clock that was plastered at his bedside, showing that it was barely 5 in the morning and that he had no need to be up so early. He brushed it aside. He strode into the bathroom to try and get a warm bath, and the silent yells accompanied with pleas for help out of his mind, something that had kept on torturing him since he had awoken from his not-so-peaceful slumber. The water eased the pain as it felt warm and encasing around his body, giving him a sense of relief and peace while distracting him from his inner musings. Once finished he changed into his uniform, knowing that he would be unable to sleep even if his classes started at 7 and that he still had time to catch a small nap, so as to say. Ichigo dried his short yet long orange hair while trying to distract himself and looked at the new timetable he had gained just yesterday, knowing that it would be a pain in the ass to try and stay low when he just so happened to jump 4 grades in one go. It's going to be harder to fool the teachers. That was his current train of thought. He didn't want to start thinking about his dream, even if he knew it was unavoidable, even if he knew that it would be talked about the moment he saw his inner spirits, and since he was actually planning on going to visit until it's time for his lessons, he knew it would be sooner rather than later. He let down the towels to let them dry on their own, leaving them extended so that they wouldn't smell. Ichigo turned to look at his window, bringing a hand slowly to touch the corner of the paper-made window with much care and patience. One would think he was about to touch something very fragile. He let out a small pulse of Ryatsu, and it resonated silently with something that seemed to start on that corner, expanding itself throughout the whole room, while giving a shimmer that showed there was a barrier. He brought down his hand, satisfied with the response he was given, and taking a deep breath to level out his Ryatsu, knowing that it was most likely fluctuating slightly, thanks to the more than normal use he just so happened to be using mere seconds ago. After all, checking a captain-level barrier for fractures or deformations was not an easy task. Undecided it was more than okay he let it disappear back into nothingness, knowing that even if it was technically impossible to discover it was best left invisible. He sat down on his futon while deciding he would go visit his inner spirits for some morning sparring, wanting to keep up with his reflexes and abilities and not let them diminish and get rusty. He just hoped that he could avoid talking about his dreams like last time, that he was able to push the topic aside. For being. The bell signaling the entrance to class resounded through the hallways of the Shinigami Academy. Sound making every student go into their destined classes so that they would not get scolded, more than actually wanting to be punctual. The teachers followed right behind, getting into their respective classroom so that they could start to teach the lesson of the day, lessons that had barely restarted thanks to the fact that winter break had just ended. In the particular classroom the chatter of gossip never stopped even as the teacher entered the room. They were all so concentrated on the newest revelation that they had yet to even notice her presence. She cleared her throat trying to gain at least a small part of their attention to no avail and having to resort to a major alternative. She slammed her thick hard-covered book on the desk, making every student jump in their seats and those who had yet to be seated scurrying over to their seats. She smirked, loving the startled reaction she had gained before looking around the room to see if she finally had their attention. Very well, now that I have silence we can start with class. But before that I have the honor of introducing a new classmate that has just been transferred into this group. The curious mutters started again, showing how they were talking of that precisely some seconds ago. The teacher smiled, loving the suspense she seemed to be giving the students that were waiting expectantly the newcomer. She smirked once more before turning towards the door to call out to the one that just so happened to be outside, making the new classmate walk inside with a face of indifference, making many stare wide eyes at the orange-haired boy. Well class, this here is your new classmate. Present yourself please. He nodded, turning to look at the class with a pompous demeanor, even if he had around 30 pair of eyes directed towards him, not even twitching when several snickers or mummers resounded in the closed-up room. Ajimemashite, my name is Shiba Ichigo, I hope we can get along. He gave a shallow bow, surprising many at the formal yet informal way the orange head seemed to carry himself, obviously being from nobility, but not really giving the air of an arrogant everyday prick. Ichigo in return didn't think anything of the curious gazes he seemed to gain, not really caring when the whole classroom and most likely the whole school seemed to talk about him. He gazed once more around the room before his amber eyes widened ever so slightly thanks to the two that happened to be seated in the back, making his expression a bit more livelier, but far from looking surprised for a normal person even if he was. What are Kamraku-san and Ukitake-san doing in the academy? He was thoughtful, trying to think of all the possibilities as to why the hell one of the oldest captains of the Soul Society was still in school and came to a terrifying and bone-chilling conclusion. I'm even more into the past than I thought. He tried to remember his frequent talks with the two captains to try and draw out any number of years they might have mentioned to see if he could finally gain an exact number and how back he had gone to no avail. He just couldn't concentrate at the moment, that was for sure. He was abruptly interrupted by the teacher's voice gaining his attention, even if he had yet to show that he wasn't paying attention in the first place. Shiba-sama, could you take a seat? Ichigo had the urge to groan from the suffix, hating how in the past they were even more prone to being formal. Even if you were a brat in the academy, he really despised this more than anything. He turned to look at the teacher with a small, very much fake even, if mostly no one realized smile on his face, while trying to give his friendliest voice possible. I don't mind if the suffix isn't added. And this goes to everyone. I'm not particularly fond of being referred to as Sama. The teacher seemed surprised by this for a second before nodding and giving out an equally honest smile. Ichigo could have sworn he heard a small murmur of a voice talking in between each other and couldn't help but shudder at the sudden bad feeling he got. In the end he chose to ignore it and follow previous instructions and sitting down on a free seat at the end left side of the room quite close to the two future captains, since they just so happened to gain his curiosity, something that was quite hard to do given the fact that he had been something akin to uncaring in the past, present and future. Ichigo heard the teacher start her lesson, starting with basic Shinigami duties, since her class just so happened to be office duties, something that was very much frowned upon by the majority of the Shinigami officers and in training, but since he really didn't care, he quickly tuned out from what she was saying, deciding that taking out his notebook and writing small notes to show that he was paying attention even if he wasn't was more than needed. He didn't want to be scolded so soon. The orange head turned to look at his left when he heard a small sound, but once he did he quickly regretted it because he was suddenly face to face with none other than Kamraku Shunsui that was curious with wide grey eyes that made his own amber go wide as well. Kamraku gave a wide smile that made Ichigo completely forget about the calm captain of the 8 and only see an overexcited boy with brown hair that just so happened to be in his class. Hello Shiba-san, my name is Kamraku Shunsui and this here is my best friend Ukitake Sherm, it's nice to meet you. Ichigo composed himself rather quickly when he noticed how the white-haired male was eyeing him with something akin to sympathy, apparently very much used to seeing Shunsui in his current state of mind. Hi. This seemed to surprise the other, not taking Ichigo for being a shy person, since he had spoken his mind in front of the class, like if it were something normal. He raised a brown eyebrow ever so slightly, before shrugging it off, knowing that the orange head had to be surprised, since he had suddenly spoken up just like that, so instead he decided to try and be friendly. After all, that was basically the idea. Do you want us to stalk the new kid? Yamamoto shook his head, very much exasperated since the boys before him seemed to be getting the wrong idea, and that could be bad. No, I want you two to look after the boy. He's new to some of the stuff you fifth-years already know, and more than anything he needs someone he can depend on if he needs it. This time Ukitake decided it would be best to answer, knowing that Shunsui was still most likely thinking of something else and not what Yamaji had in mind. So you wants us to keep an eye out for him? This time Yamamoto was more pleased thanks to the fact that at least one of the two was understanding and that maybe the idea wasn't as crazy as he had thought of at first. Exactly. I don't want you guys to follow the boy around and stalk him, I want you to look out for him. Maybe even befriend my boy. The three turned rather quickly to look at the 10th squad captain, the two students very much surprised by the sudden appearance of the Shinigami captain and the fact that he had called the reason of their discussion my boy. Rimter, what are you doing here? The raven head smiled before looking at the two that had an expression of awe and respect. They were really surprised by the presence of the captain and head of the Shiba clan, but more than anything they were surprised by the fact that the new prodigy was apparently the Shiba captain's son. Well, I wanted to see how things were going for Ichigo, but from the looks of it, he declined the offer of help, didn't he? The headmaster sighed before pinching the bridge of his nose, obviously tired of the dilemma that happened to be starting thanks to a single boy that didn't want aid. Yeah, that's true, he did reject a guide, but I'm trying to pin Shunsui and Sherm on him, so that might make a difference. The Shiba head shook his head, not wanting to give the two academy students a job that would be pretty much thrown their way. He didn't want to involve the boys in his case unwillingly, and that was precisely what was happening. They shouldn't be pushed into this. It's my problem. I just wanted to see if Ichigo would accept anybody on his own accord, not much for being a guide, but just to have someone, but apparently that'll be impossible with my unsociable son in the equation. He shrugged, knowing that it was impossible from the beginning but still wanting to try. He was brought to attention when his sleeve was tugged, and as he felt it, he turned to look at the brown-haired boy, a little bit taller than his own son, but not by much. Taicho, could this Ichigo happen to be the prodigy? Ukitake face-palmed while Yamamoto groaned, apparently very much fed up with Shunsui's comments. Could the boy not read the mood? Well, yes, that's my boy. Why? Shunsui's response was to give a wide smile, surprising everyone present when he suddenly took a turn for the better and started to act more cheerful. I'll keep an eye on him. He sounds interesting and I bet he could be a good friend if he only opens up. That sole sentence seemed to give the young Shunsui trust and acceptance from the Shiba captain, which was happy with the current outcome, enjoying the fact that maybe, just maybe, Ichigo would finally make friends. I'll leave that to you then. So, how are you taking this jumping grades thing? Ichigo glanced back to look at the younger Kamraku Shunsui, looking his way even if he was still facing the lesson. Well, it's fine. Shunsui frowned, not really liking the small responses he was gaining from the orange head. He wanted to get the other talking, was that too much to ask? So instead of trying to point that out, he tried to get a bit more conversation from the boy, not really caring for that class or the fact that Sherm was trying to gain his attention, most likely to get him to stop from doing what he was doing. When I ask, I actually meant about the rumors. You know, gossip and all that stuff isn't bothering you. This time Ukitake couldn't help but interject in the conversation, thinking that this was a bit less straightforward than what he had thought that Shunsui would start as. He's right about that. It must be a lot of trouble and pressure for you. Ichigo seemed thoughtful for a second before he turned to actually look at the two this time, since he noticed that they weren't necessarily asking something as troublesome as he had first thought they Kamraku would do. I don't let it bother me. The gossip didn't start when I jumped grades, you know, so I kinda got used to it. This surprised the two as they had not expected that kind of answer, much less an answer at all, so when he actually did answer, they couldn't help but glance and look at each other, and then back to the orange head that was paying attention once more to the class. So you really don't care? His amber orbs turned slightly to look at the white-haired boy that held a somewhat saddened expression. So instead of just shrugging the question off like he would have done to anyone else, and also knowing that he wasn't prying and was only genuinely curious and slightly worried, so Ukitake he couldn't help but see the kind smiling captain of the 13th instead of the young boy in front of him. Ichigo decided it would be okay and answered honestly. No, I've never really cared. I just let them talk all they want. It won't change who I am anyways. After that, neither of the two boys spoke up again, deciding to just spare a glance or two at the Shiba prodigy every once in a while with curiosity and well-hidden worry, knowing that even if the orange head did talk and wasn't actually cold, it would still be hard to get him to open up. Ichigo was just that kind of person. A tough nut to crack. Once the class came to an end, Ichigo couldn't help but feel relieved. He wasn't necessarily comfortable with the various glances that the whole class gave him, even if he had just told Kamraku and Ukitake he didn't care. It was just so troublesome and annoying. He was lucky his temper had been completely under control and that he no longer had the urge to punch the first person that turned to look at him. Ichigo heaved out a sigh as he strode through the long hallways of the academy and towards his next class. He still gained murmurs and glances, but it's not like he could make them stop, so he ignored it, trying to keep the most neutral face he could muster, since he had a family to think of, and as such, he couldn't just scowl at anyone that crossed his path like before. Once the gym came into view, Ichigo abruptly stopped, glancing back to stare out the window when a rather familiar spiritual pressure made its way to his senses. Apparently he wasn't that far behind in his thoughts about that presence, because the moment he actually turned was the moment his amber eyes met the familiar figure of the 4th squad captain, even if said person wasn't wearing his usual attire. The orange head was rather surprised by the unexpected appearance of Tinjirou and decided to call out to the man, striding over to the window and peering out to gain better access so as to say, "Boy. Tinjirou-san." Said person turned to look at the orange head, giving a feral grin upon locking eyes with the target and walking over to the Shiba while ignoring the various glances and murmurs they seemed to gain. "Yo, Ichigo. How you doing, squirt?" Ichigo just scoffed and rolled his eyes before giving a half-heartedly open palm strike as a greeting to the man, barely avoiding the small smile that seemed to creep its way on his lips without permission as he felt at ease in the company of someone that wasn't there for convenience or just plain curiosity. "Who you calling squirt? I'm not that shorter than you anyways." Tenjirou's grin only seemed to widen as he was obviously expecting an answer along those lines, but thought nothing of it, opting to recline himself on the wall to relax while speaking to the orange-haired brat he considered in a way as a friend. "Oh, but you're still younger, so height doesn't change a thing." The Shiba prodigy didn't seem to take hard the not-so-subtle offense and only shrugged it off, huffing in obvious exasperation while shifting himself into a more comfortable position on the window frame and somewhat mirroring the older man. Well then that just means that I'll be a brat in your eyes forever. Exactly my point. But of course that's something you should have noticed years ago. Ichigo seemed to give up on debating with the man any longer, as he really didn't care about anything that was said to him, and much less when he was taunted by said person. He was only fooling around and trying to get Ichigo riled up, so it was something that wasn't needed to get bothered about. So instead of pursuing the line of talk any longer, he decided to get to the main point while he still had time and his class was yet to start. So, what are you doing here? And lacking your uniform as well. I came looking for you actually. The Shiba was actually shocked by the response before he hit it well and turned to look at the raven head to see if he wasn't pulling his leg or something, only to find him serious as ever, which wasn't much by the way, and no joking around expression in place, looking a little saddened, which was kinda rare, and as Ichigo suddenly noticed lacking his usual pipe as well. Why? Well, I'll be leaving today in a little while actually. Tinjirou honestly looked troubled for a second before he hid that apprehension deep down and turned to look at Ichigo, sad smile forming on his face while replacing his usual amusing smirk. I'm going to the royal palace. Ichigo sighed before he gazed up into the blue sky, knowing that the man was most likely waiting for his answer, but not really being ready to give one just yet, so he tried to delay it if just a little. He noticed that the eavesdroppers he had gained at first were now only mild and really just there and not almost falling over while trying to hear and not look suspicious at all. Ichigo noticed that the clouds passed with a slower trail than usually and looked troubled, so much like his inner feelings that for a moment there he actually felt like showing it out in the exterior as well. Upon realizing where his thoughts were going towards, he couldn't help but scold himself in his very own way because he had known this day would come, so he didn't need to feel this way. It was just useless crap. The newest prodigy never really turned to look at his companion, but he decided staying silent was worse than actually speaking up, so he did. Trying to convey his thoughts and as girlish as it may sound feelings so that the previous 4th squad captain could get the message through and maybe just maybe go in a bit more peace than what he would leave, as if Ichigo decided to stay silent. You know, I kinda knew this day would come someday. It would be awfully stupid of the Spirit King if he didn't notice your talent, even if you are a nut job, but even so it's a little sad to know you'll be leaving. This time Ichigo did turn to look at the man, and he let the playful smirk grace his lips as he said the last words that may not hold much significance, but more than anything held a hidden meaning and purpose. Now who'll play tag with me, huh? The message seemed to do its job as Tinjirou's smile returned to its playfulness and mischievous nature, giving many passing students the shudders, but more than anything giving Ichigo a response of thanks. Yeah, well, you'll have to find a new kitty to play with. Ichigo seemed to be taken aback for a moment as he was suddenly reminded of a certain someone, but quickly hid it, thinking how ironic life was and that Tinjirou had no idea of how right he was. I guess I'll find one sooner or later. They shared a glance before the older man pushed himself off the wall and turned to look at the orange head with a wide smirk, thanks and a little bit of melancholy written all over it as he raised a hand to say bye and leave in a swish of shunpo. The only thing left that said how he once stood there being the soft breeze of the movement that would seem magical and fast to any student but a certain Kurosaki Ichigo, or as he was going by now, Shiba Ichigo. Shit. 4. Dodging was the first thing that came to mind when Ichigo entered the dojo 20 seconds late, and as his senses never actually failed him he went with the flow, knowing that it may look weird for any outsider, but not really being able to stop himself since he was already moving to avoid a roundhouse kick that was directed his way by pure instinct. He bent himself back, almost making a complete arc and showing just how flexible he was for a man. He got his bearings back quicker than one would think and returned to his normal posture, barely stopping himself from returning the gesture when he finally noticed that the person that had actually delivered the kick in the first place was the Hakuta teacher. What he did do though was getting in a defensive stance, more than prepared to receive any more attacks, even if he highly doubted the teacher would try so again, and even more so because Ichigo was now ready for it and there would be no more surprises. I wanted to teach the newbie a lesson. He was completely right in thinking that he wouldn't be attacked again when he took in the teacher that just so happened to attack him, having to suppress the small chuckle that wanted to escape his lips at the posture the Hakuta teacher ported. The man had chocolate-colored skin with bright yellow eyes and black mid-back hair. He had his arms crossed in front of his chest and had a very visible pout in place, showing just how disappointed he was that Ichigo had dodged his attack and more than anything, effortlessly. But, when his previous words sunk in, Ichigo couldn't help but scowl, very much annoyed at the fact that he was being belittled even if he was supposed to be an academy student and that the teacher was most likely doing it just for his own amusement. But even if he himself was not at all amused, he decided to hide his annoyance with his usual blank facade. Isn't it better that I was able to dodge? The raven head was thoughtful for a second before he shrugged it off, not in the least bothered by the obvious point and the fact that the whole class was actually watching with glittering curiosity and some sort of awe because the previous first year had avoided an attack that would have been too much for even them to handle. The only reason why they might be able to dodge is because they had learned the hard way that this particular teacher liked to attack out of the blue. Maybe, but still, you took my fun away. Ichigo didn't seem amused one bit by how this particular instructor was more than just a little off and that he seemed to ignore his point, not really caring for the fact that he was cutting time of the lesson and that more than one student was throwing dirty glances his way. But before he could even get a good look of who was being an ass at him, the over-enthusiastic teacher brought his attention, apparently finally have finished his sulking of how unfun it was and that it would have been better if he had let the kick hit. Well anyway. My name is Shimon Takahiro and I'm the Hakuta teacher for advanced 5th and 6th years. I hope you don't disappoint Prodigy-san. Seeing that they were finally getting somewhere, Ichigo gave a shallow bow, not at all surprised by the fact that the man before him was a Shimon and that he acted the way he did. Shimons had a knack for being playful and serious the next second. Likewise, Shiba Ichigo, I hope I keep up to your designated standards. And with that the class began, being practical for its majority and only having some small explanations of stances and attacks, but all being mostly demonstrated and needing a somewhat open area in which they just so happened to be in. The Shiba prodigy as he was called by the Shimon instructor, followed perfectly throughout the lesson, receiving various praises on how he was very advanced for a previous first year and that apparently it was a good idea to send him all the way up to 5th. Though, even with all the moves and stances Ichigo had done perfectly, the Hakuta teacher had decided that said orange head would do a mock battle next class to show what he was really made of so that he could ascertain just how talented he really was. The orange head had only shrugged off the challenge with only mild disturbance, feeling that was pretty well masked as his disturbance was directed to how harder it would be to hide his knowledge and ability in front of a whole 30 set of eyes. On the other hand, what had happened that did bother Ichigo and what he had noticed throughout the whole class was that he kept on receiving dirty looks from a small group of punks as he had come to dub them that just looked ready to jump him, having a certain dangerous feeling to them and more than anything just plain jealous, though if they noticed this last fact was still a mystery to Ichigo, probably not anyway. But, even if one or two of the members of said punk sometimes came close to hitting him when practicing, Ichigo didn't let it bother him, knowing that these kind of people were prone to exist here and everywhere and that he could do nothing about it and much less during class. The thing that the orange head didn't notice however was how he received slightly worried glances from a certain Ukitake Sherm and Kamraku Shunsui, the two boys seeing clearly the ordeal and not liking it one bit but not being able to do a thing anyways. At the end of said class the bell rang and everyone scurried out to the cafeteria, knowing that there would be a line if you waited even a second longer and that all the good food or at least the better ones would be over soon. Ichigo did so as well, knowing this fact and only limiting himself to a low level of Shino Academy level to get a higher chance of getting out before the first years that were still very clumsy and said art arrived. He did get the expected results and the moment the orange head was able to secure himself an onigiri bento he left, going out the doors and going to his usual eating place under a tree to eat in peace. Ichigo didn't particularly like to eat in the cafeteria. While the orange head had done all this the two boys still kept on observing, stalking him, checking out his every move and frowning upon seeing him leave. It was kinda incredible that even with Ichigo's ridiculous colored hair his absence was not really noticed and that apparently it was a very common occurrence. Kamraku groaned before bringing up a hand to yank at his not-so-long brown locks, obviously exasperated by the prodigy's behavior and finally seeing the depth of the problem. Great, and I thought the problem was hard when I noticed the nasty looks K and his goon sent him. This is just plain hard. Ukitake gave his best friend a compassionate glance, knowing that even if he would complain and laze around of how annoying it was to actually do stuff when he brought his mind to do something he would do it. Well, it was your idea to take in the responsibility before seeing the grievance of the circumstances. Not helping Ju-chan. The white-haired boy just shrugged, not caring that his long-life friend was throwing a fit for something that was quite useless to brought about, or either the fact that they were now moving on to a bench in the outside place they usually went to eat when they wanted space for themselves, while he was still listening to the brown-haired male's whines. Ah. This is so stressful. Don't brood, Shunsui, there is nothing we can do about it. But you, Yamamoto said to look out for the new kid and help him if he needed it, but he's a prodigy. What can we do? The white-haired boy rolled his eyes, having had enough of his best friend's complaints. He glanced to the side when something orange brought his attention, turning to look at the side and seeing the prodigy eating on his own under a tree. Upon seeing this, Ukitake couldn't help but sigh, thinking how Shunsui was right and how it was just so hard to approach the kid, and the worst of all was that he was too good at what he did. He didn't even need help, they couldn't go up to him with the excuse of helping him out. Kamaraku just turned to look at what he was seeing before his eyes landed on the culprit of his demise, glancing back to looking at his best friend with a face that read all over it, see what I mean? The just plain pissed the white-haired male not really showing it and not being much anyway, since he really couldn't seem to hold his anger. Ukitake was about to sigh once more and agree with his companion when all of a sudden a loud noise brought both of their attentions, turning to look in the direction of the orange-haired prodigy, so fast one would think they had just gained a whiplash, and what they saw just made them widen in eyes. Chapter 6. The wind brushed lightly against tan-colored skin, creating a sort of goosebump feeling as it did so. The leaves rustled as the breeze played with their light forms and made many fall in their wake. The chirps resounded slowly yet melodiously, letting a soothing sound find its way to ears of a silent figure that sat cross-legged underneath a great maple tree that worked as a haven of torments and gossips that seemed to come with much ease when he was around people. The flicker of light that passed by the small holes of the leaves made ceiling sometimes blinded him from seeing past his very own tranquility, and that was something that in its very own way he was thankful for. The tranquility that seemed to overcome him when he came to this place just very well made him forget of those godlike enemies he had faced in the past, the tortures and pain he and many others were tested to overcome over and over again as the war raged on with never-ending ease and hostility. This little haven that very well created a barrier for him that sometimes could only be found in the Shiba Manor backyard, which was basically a whole forest or his own inner world of cold skyscrapers that reached past the very clouds and all the way to a new world. But Ichigo had found an untrembling support from this maple tree when he came to eat lunch there, and that very nearly soothed him to forget of all his responsibilities and pain. All the things he wished to leave behind but at the same time frightened him to forget, the cries, the sorrow and pure display that plagued his memories of good and bad. His little place that could always bring some peace. That was, until it was completely disrupted by snot-nosed bastards that didn't know when to stay put. Well, look who's here. Our new buddy Mr. Prodigy-san. The peaceful haven was completely destroyed and the cruel reality came crushing down on him as Ichigo glanced up to look at the group of 5 punks that had dared disturb him in his tranquility. His eyes held no malice however, only mirroring the coldness beneath his very soul that was represented in chilly metal and glass buildings. Eyes that only showed uncare and discipline of every and all emotions as not even one slipped through his cold exterior, making the 5 cower, even if they had previously come with cocky smirks on their faces. However, one seemed to be unaffected by the cold and unnerving gaze the orange head sent their way and proceeded to kick the half-eaten bento that was on Ichigo's hands, creating a dull noise amidst the previous silence. I'm talking to you. Shiba scum. This seemed to gain his attention as the previous first year stood up with ease and grace befit of someone hiding every bit of power and strength underneath layers and layers of perfect Riatsu control. That was something that no one seemed to understand even now. You can talk anything you want about me. I really don't care. But. The ominous pause seemed to gain the desired effect as the previously brave boy finally noticed the unhidden coldness Ichigo was radiating before, making him take half a step back as the Shinigami in training's dull amber eyes gazed directly into his. Don't speak crap about my family. Or I can't guarantee everything will end well. Ho, lo looks like I stepped on an unnerved pretty boy. Even as the boy spoke his voice was unable to stay steady and cracked many times along the way, making his buddies well aware of his unhidden fear and how they had obviously stepped on unwinnable boundaries. The Shiba prodigy however stood quietly, not in the least caring that he was being unusually cold or that he was scaring his classmates, even if he had yet to really speak coldly, the only thing that actually looked unnerving and made him seem untouchable being his eyes. Well, I think we should try to get along better, don't you think, Prodigy-san? The tall male that was the one actually doing the speaking of the group grabbed a bit more confidence when Ichigo's eyes strayed to look past them and to something else, making him feel less threatened and a lot more cocky. I think we started off in the wrong foot. Nah, noble trash. He had seriously made his grin spread and reach his eyes, and that slightly if not really unnerved his fellow buddies punks as they tried to gain his attention and convey how much of a bad idea this really was after all. Maybe we can start again. Try to do everything the right way, without frauds like you did to get in 5th year. The crack was heard, and the 4 punks that came with the main punk turned to look what the sound was only to pale from who was standing behind them. But of course main punk didn't notice this and continued. What? You honestly thought that nobody would know how much bullshit your ability is? It's just plain impossible to be talented enough to jump 4 grades. Leave, I have nothing to do with your little jealousy tantrum. The taller boy cringed, suddenly taken aback by the cold voice Ichigo seemed to use, voice that made him want to back away, even if he knew he had started it in the first place. But even so he stood as tall as he could and prepared himself to strike, not expecting it all to be stopped by anyone and knowing he would have to go through with his threats like a man he was. What? You're getting mad because I put you in evidence, it's not my fault you noble bastards always do underhanded things. Leave. Everyone involuntarily flinched at the coldness of the tone used, shivers went down their spine as a sudden chill that was foreign from the cold winter appeared out of nowhere, a sudden weight that was previously non-existent, making them very aware of their current situation. I shall not repeat it again. Leave. Leave unless you want to discover yourself why I jumped 4 grades in the first place. The main punk was shocked to no end, completely ignoring the tug of his shahakusho and the various mummers that his fellow punks made to gain his attention. Wanting more than anything to show the orange head that he was not to be messed with even if on the inside he was trembling with fear. Why you, want to fight or something? Hey K, this is bad. Behind us. Shut up. He started the fight. I didn't do anything wrong. This fake did. The now named K turned to point at the orange head, every bit of pressure on him as not only Ichigo's threat lingered closely, but the comments from his buddies did as well. But, before K could even blink he was startled by a hand on his shoulder, making him look slowly back to stare into unwavering amber. Back off K, you have nothing left to do here. Feeling the threat at being grabbed from behind by his now decided enemy, he lifted up a hand to strike with a Reiatsu-induced punch that would have defiantly hurt a student had they not been Ichigo. The strike never connected however. Being stopped on the last minute by none other than Kairaku Shunsui that had been previously standing behind them and waiting for the perfect moment to intervene. Mama, I doubt we should get into a fight so soon, should we? This seemed to bring K out of his raged state as he snapped out of whatever eyrie he had entered. Finally noticing that Ukitake and Kairaku had been behind them this whole time. Hey Kairaku, Shunsui. The small and playful smile that was on Shunsui's face quickly morphed to something that made him look all the more intimidating than he already was. The unusual and never-present smile that made K shiver in fear even more so now that he had 2 bone-chilling people as his near vicinity. Leave. K yanked his hand from the grip Shunsui had him in, making a snarl-like sound while retreating with his petrified buddies. I'll remember this. When the group of 5 left, Shunsui breathed a sigh of relief as he glanced to look at his white-haired friend that had a frown that clearly read how disapproving he was of his actions, but not being that against it at the same time. As he asserted Sherm's expression, he once more turned to this time look at the orange head which was kneeling down and picking up the previous bento that was now on the floor in a heap of trash and uneatable food. Shunsui frowned as he walked to the mess and helped clean up as well, looking at the Shiba but not really being able to see his expression like he did with Sherm. You alright Shiba-san? The white-haired teen walked over as well, crouching down slightly while putting his hands on his knees to get a better view of the mess, trying to be as soft as possible since he thought the orange head was bound to be angry or maybe even offended. What he didn't expect however, and neither did Shunsui, was for Ichigo to look up and stare directly in his eyes with a small yet very much there smile on his face. Yes, everything's okay. There really was no need to intervene, but even then I'm grateful. This made both teens freeze, not being able to believe the fakeness of such expression as Ichigo finally stood at his full height. A damaged and battered bento in his hands that made them realize that Ichigo seriously didn't get to eat much before he was disrupted. But the same fake smile as before, one that looked so different from the one he had given their Shinigami duties teacher not so long ago. He spoke again, voice not even betraying his real expression and not a hint of uncertainty in place. Then, if you'll excuse me. Before the two could even call out to the orange head, he disappeared, a perfectly assaulted shunpo being used as he flickered out of existence. Obvious demonstration that the newest fifth year was more than deserving of the promotion and making any and every doubt they had had before completely disappear along with the orange head, because the two teens would have to be complete idiots like K and his buddies to not notice how Ichigo was more than ready for the attack that Shunsui had prevented. Shunsui had actually protected them, not him. The silence stayed as it was for a while after Ichigo had left, the steady yet muffled presence that they had come to recognize as the prodigies being detectable yet untraceable as they tried to think of what to do next and maybe even search for him, but the two found no answer. Shunsui stood at his full height at last. Sherm turned to look at the brunette to find any sort of answer. And when he did, he found none. 5. This fake did. Fake. I guess you can catalog me as such, can't you? His company stayed quiet, not wanting to respond to such question, as they were sure that they could do nothing to appease Ichigo's uncertainty. They had a hard time doing so before, now it would only be worse. Aizen was a fake bastard to the end, remember. I guess that's the reason why I was the only being that could actually understand him to some point. Deception facades, something we excelled in, didn't we? It's not the same. Seeing as he finally got a response, Ichigo turned to look at his Shinigami hollow counterpart, putting on a sad smile that was genuine to no end. A smile that demonstrated just how much sadness was hidden beneath everything and how that smile lacked any sentiment but despair. It's the same, we just had a different purpose in mind. Bubbles seemed to erupt as Ichigo shifted in his place on the cold skyscraper, one of the many skyscrapers that were flooded in his inner world every single time he went back to brooding and overthinking things, but ask him if he cared. The water would disappear once he got his bearings back in place, so who was he to start whining over this as well? He was used to it. Ichigo involuntarily chuckled as his thoughts kept on drifting farther and farther away from reality and into a sea of memories that always assaulted him when he was most vulnerable. Fact that was well known by his two counterparts that stepped forward to place a hand on each of Ichigo's shoulders where he sat at the edge of the submerged skyscraper. You know, it's funny how right he seems to be at times when I think of all the philosophical bullshit he would spout out in the middle of fights or when he wanted to make a dramatic ending, that bastard. Zangetsu seemed to be the calmest at the time when he saw the unforgiving rage that seeped deep beneath the golden eyes of a certain someone as they both saw how truly deep Ichigo was this time. It was sometimes hard to keep on dragging Ichigo out of his depressions by themselves. They weren't able to depend on the Shibas lately because Ichigo had moved out, so it was turning harder and harder to keep their king on the throne when he had nothing to keep him together where he was now. No friends or acquaintance to support him as his new family did, and that in its own way sometimes overcame the orange head. What are you talking about, Ichigo? The old man was grateful when he received a reaction from Ichigo and that he wasn't that drowned in despair as to not notice his surroundings, turning slowly to look at his Quincy counterpart for better assessment of his next words. That time he told me us how the true betrayal was not the one we can see, but that which we cannot perceive. I think he is right, you know. You're talking about Aizen King. The albino seemed to spit out the name, rage very predominate in his tone as he cursed the man to the very depths of hell for starting that war and turning his king into what he had become. A godlike being that was only holding up by a thin piece of tape. Yeah, he's a bastard, you know, but he's also a genius. I wonder how he was able to stand the loneliness so long. He was making more sense, that was for sure, something that the two spirits were silently grateful for. At least they were able to draw away from the first topic to be touched. The fakeness. You're not lonely, king, you got us, don't ya? The Shiba involuntarily smiled. Gesture that was less saddened as it was before, making the albino make a double take when Ichigo actually made his smile widen into a full-grown grin that looked so real it paled in comparison to Ichigo's previous facades, the one used in front of the future captains not counting because this smile, this expression was not fake in the least. Yeah, I still have you too. The two spirits froze, not believing even for a second that what was in front of them was real, even if, after the next blink they took the grin disappeared into a sad smile that they were oh so familiar with. Ichigo, you? I never broke down, you know, at least not today. Silence plagued the panoramic city of blue as the three abruptly shut up, not one nor two muttering a single word as the graveness of that sentence clicked in both Zangetsu's mind because for Ichigo to not having gone over his breaking point and actually admitting that he had done so before was outstanding in its own way. Something they had yet to understand fully until now. He had not gone into a deep hole. So you didn't lose it? This time the albino was responded by an elbow in the gut, blow that was not even damped down to prevent damage as he fell over in a heap of curses and whines, but even so a satisfied smirk forming in the inside. It's not that I go insane like you, idiot, I just tend to go too deep into shit, that's all. This eased up the previous tension that had formed on all three of them. Ichigo still thinking of K's words even if he didn't let them plague him. He didn't need more tortures to add to his collection. He already had more than enough. So as everything settled down into a more tranquil environment, Ichigo decided it would be better to leave and go back into the real world. Back to reality. The orange head let himself go as he fell down and letting the everlasting darkness engulf him and knowing his partners would let him. They should know what he was doing and they would accept that Ichigo was good enough to leave. That he would somehow overcome it. So they did. And he came back to reality. 5. Just so you know, I blame you. Why me? I didn't do anything bad. It was both our idea to go look for him. But even when I told you I couldn't pinpoint his location, you went on and on about how we'd find him anyways. I really thought we would. Now we're late because of its shoe. The brunette decided to stay quiet and stop his whining, knowing that when his white-haired best friend acted like this, it was nearly impossible to make him change his mind. And it really wasn't his fault. They both wanted to find Ichigo even if it was kinda impossible given the circumstances. The other teen in appearance only was a real prodigy. He knew how to perfectly mask his Ryatsu so that he was well, there, but even then you really couldn't tell how far away or close he was. It was just plain confusing and neither Shunsui nor Jikshurm were able to pinpoint Ichigo's exact location in the end and now they were late for their next class, meditation. Ah. There's the classroom. The two came to an abrupt halt, cringing at the knowledge that they were sure to get scolded, even if it was for a good reason, but, as the door was slowly opened by Shunsui, the sight that greeted him was not one he was expecting. Ichigo was sitting amongst the rest of the class with his normal face that clearly read, "I don't give a damn about what you think," as he did so, not looking in the least shaken up or fake as he did a mere half an hour ago, and that at least made both late teens sigh in relief. "What are you sighing at, brats?" The deep baritone voice shocked them out of their musings as they finally concentrated on the class and not on the orange head alone. Chikshurm slowly turned to look at their teacher with a calm yet warm smile which he was familiar for, trying to ease the situation as best as he could. "Good day, sensei. Sorry we're late, we had to leave something in our dorm room before coming to class." This seemed to catch the small teacher off guard, not really believing the story, but still being quite shocked that she had received an excuse from Chikshurm and not Shunsui like it always happened. The white-haired, kind-hearted boy had a problem with lying though he was slowly getting better. It's alright I guess. So long as you don't do it again." "Yes, sensei." The two were ushered in rather silently, joining in with the rest of the class that, as strangely as it sounds, lacked the usual punks at the far corner of the room. It was quite peaceful without them actually. "Alright, now that we have most of the class present and that there are no more interruptions, I'll finally give you the news I was going to give you after coming from winter break." Everyone started rather intently at the teacher, excitement and unsettledness seeping out in great amounts as the suspense was killing them. Suspense that seemed to entertain the teacher instead as her smile took a turn for a more sadistic side. "You'll be able to carry your Zanpakuto at all time now. And if you have a blade you want to use for the rest of your short or long career as a Shinigami then bring it in, we'll finally begin decisive training to gain your Shikai." This seemed to gain a round of cheers as the news was something they had actually been looking forward to. Something that Ichigo was really grateful for because he seriously didn't think he could last another spare with those toys the instructors called Zanpakuto. They were so breakable and weak. "We want to establish a connection with the dormant spirit in your soul, so spending your time in company of the base for the Zanpakuto to manifest is a good way to do so. The spirit will latch itself to the Asauchi and then little by little, we'll establish a connection with the spirit, so please keep your Zanpakuto with you as close by as possible and remember to use it well. We don't need a civilian being threatened by a Zanpakuto, so behave in and out of school grounds at all time." The instructions seemed to gain the instructor a swift chorus of "hi" as they all started on their very own chat of how exciting it would be and that it was incredible that they were finally able to carry their Zanpakutos out of the gyms and training areas. Ichigo however was shining with well-hidden relief and happiness that he would finally be able to use Zangetsu instead of the stupid Asauchi and that he wouldn't have to sneak the black-hilted blade in and out of his room all the time. He really loved this new privilege granted to them, but more than anything he could now gloat of both Zangetsu's steady presence closer to him that always seemed to be able to ease his pains easier in close vicinity and that would become useful. A trigger to help him put on a better facade. "Shiba-san." Ichigo turned to look in the direction where the familiar voice came from, very aware that the two Shinigami in training were looking at him with something akin to sympathy and worry, which made him realize how much he had screwed up with that fake smile he had pulled off earlier. "Yeah?" The two glanced to look at each other, not really trusting themselves to start off the conversation, but at the same time not wanting to throw away the chance they currently had to speak with the orange head, scared that he would leave again like nothing and that he would be untraceable once more. But at least here they were in class even if the teacher was letting them converse with each other and it would look weird if Ichigo would just leave like that, so they were pretty sure he wouldn't do it this time around. But as the silence continued Ichigo turned back to stare at the front of the class, not really caring that both Shunsui and Chikshurm were staring at him and that they were obviously bothered by what happened earlier. Of course they would. There's a limit to how dumb one can be to not realize that fakeness. And of course the future captains were far from dumb even if they were still brats and even when Shunsui sometimes acted like a kid in the past, present and future. The only plus that this young Kairaku Shunsui seemed to have that the older version didn't have was that he was more inclined to do rash stuff or speak before thinking out of the blue. Almost like right now. "Hey Shiba-san, do you want to go with Yu-chan and me to buy a new sheath for our Zanpakuto?" Huh? Both Ichigo and Chikshurm were frozen in place, not believing even for a second what Shunsui had spoken, because, seriously, it just wasn't possible was it? What the hell are you thinking Shu? The brunette seemed to be confused for a second, processing his own words, and then Chikshurm's before the frightening truth dawned over him. He had done something stupid again. Or maybe not. The feral grin spread across Shunsui's face as a perfect plan formulated in his head, one that even Chikshurm would have to acknowledge, even if it came out nowhere like it had done. Maybe his recklessness was a good thing sometimes. "Yeah, go out all three of us, you know we're going to be carrying our own Zanpakuto, and well us being a part of a noble family, even if a minor one unlike the Shiba we usually gain a Zanpakuto long before entering the academy, so I think a special blade deserves a special sheath." Silence kept on going on Chikshurm's side as he stared at the doucheball he called best friend, wanting to discover what the hell was going on in that big head of his and still not catching up with Shunsui's plan. Ichigo on the other hand had gone out of his initial shock and was able to blankly stare at the brunette, not a glint of surprise in his expression, even as he said his next words. "You do realize you two barely met me today, right?" "Yup. And that's precisely why I want all three of us to go. To get to know you better and strengthen our growing friendship. Ichigo in response eyed before pinching the bridge of his nose, not really being able to catch up with the other's enthusiasm and unusual positivism. But the orange head seriously couldn't find a good response for the invitation. So it's settled, we'll go today after the next class since on Monday we don't have any evening lessons. This seemed to bring Ichigo back to reality and made him slightly flustered as he stammered in his words, not finding a quick enough excuse before it was already too late and the two were already out of earshot, Shunsui dragging Jikshurm away and the white-haired teen letting him at the same time. But 5. What are you planning, Shu? Well, it'd be bad if we talked about something like that in front of the class where others can hear, and we don't think Shiba-sen will willingly enter a friendly chat with, as he said, people he just met, so I thought this was a good idea. Jikshurm seemed to ponder on this, thinking that maybe what Shunsui was saying actually made sense because, let's face it, Shunsui never seemed to make sense completely. Yeah, I guess it is. Shunsui broke into a wide grin, liking that his idea was actually useful and he hadn't screwed up in the end. Now they just needed to make sure that they made the best of their time and if Shiba-san flees. And that. 5. Knock knock knock, Shiba-san. Knock knock knock, Shiba-san, we know you're in there. Another dull knock, and that had been the 15th one, and Ichigo still didn't know where Shunsui found the enthusiasm to continue. The orange head had come in through the window since he had gone into the forest earlier, and what was his surprise that the brunette and white-haired male were outside his door and pounding onto it without mercy. He had actually forgotten about that problem, but arriving mere seconds ago to the current situation made him clearly remember. He opened the door with much precaution, not wanting to get hit by a new knock in the process, but still not wanting to ignore the two boys. But, it was rather surprising to see Shunsui grinning like a Cheshire cat and having an equally satisfied Jikshurm at his side, almost like if they had both won the lottery when Ichigo had just opened the door. Shiba-san. Let's go into town. The orange head blinked, clearly used to Shunsui's rather enthusiastic demeanor and not really taken aback at his actions. So instead of thinking about declining, he turned around to look for his partner, not even taking a second to tell the two what he was about to do and not being surprised when they waited for him to come back. Once he had Zangetsu secured at his waist, he came back to the door to be greeted by the two future captains, both having their own unique blades strapped to their waist and waiting rather patiently for Ichigo. Ready, Shiba-san? Ichigo just sighed before nodding, closing the door to his room before letting out a small flicker of Riatsu to activate an unharmful barrier that just notified him if someone trespassed. He really couldn't get used to being carefree anymore. The 3 academy students walked in silence as they stalked out the dormitories and school gate, not really minding the particularly weird atmosphere that didn't seem to be able to decide itself between tense and peaceful. The silence, however, was quickly disrupted when Shunsui spoke up, not really finding any problem in entering a friendly conversation and wanting to lighten up the mood. So Shiba-sen, I wanted to ask. Ichigo turned to look at the brunette, thinking that an inquiry from today's confrontation was sure to come and fully expecting it. This is why he tried to distance himself as far away as possible from people lately, they were just so troublesome. Can we call you Ichigo instead? Of course you can call us by our first name as well, so I wanted to know if you wouldn't mind. The orange head was quickly taken aback by the quite innocent question, not really processing fast enough the question as he blinked in silent question before turning back to the path in front of him. I don't mind. I said so earlier in class. Yeah, well, just wanted to make sure it didn't bother you. As Ichigo just nodded and understanding, Jikshurm stared on with newfound curiosity. The orange head was really special and unique, but most of all he was just full of surprises that made you think he was a heartless bastard and then the next you would think he was just an isolated boy. Really weird coming from a family as cheerful as the Shibas. So what kind of sheaths are you guys going to get? Well, I was thinking something along the lines of a sea blue. What about you two? I want something cool that reflects my sparkling personality. The white-haired male just rolled his eyes before looking at Ichigo, question lingering on for him as well and expecting an answer, even if the orange head looked like he hadn't been hearing the whole conversation. Don't really know yet, never really thought of it, I only have the black scabbard, and that's it. That sole statement made the brunette keep on babbling on and on about how Ichigo should have an idea of what he wanted and then proceeding to give the Shiba ideas of his own on what Ichigo could get, and all the while Jikshurm watched while intervening every now and then to try and point out obvious facts or stuff he thought were too overboard. Ichigo on the other hand had stayed quiet the whole way, never stopping Shunsui's rambling and never really responding to the inquiries of what he would like and how he would look cool with various designs Shunsui had come up with. Ichigo had just listened, well-hidden amusement lingering in his soul as he heard the one-sided bickering between the two innocent boys, which were so naive that Ichigo could hardly associate them with their future selves. The future duo he had come to know pretty well and respect. The two he had to some degree been able to open up for advice. These two, however, were not superiors or seniors. They were just students. Just like what he was pretending to be. Nothing but a fake in all but name. 5. Ichigo-kun, what do you think about this one? The orange head stared rather intently at the 5th scabbard shown to him up until now, really feeling that something was missing, even if he couldn't actually pinpoint it. He glanced to the side to see the other 2 beautiful sheaths placed rather carefully on the table, and then back to the deep blue almost black sheath Sherm was showing him. He just couldn't decide when the other 2 had long from decided. He didn't particularly dislike the wooden trinket, it's just that it didn't catch his eye like he had liked, and that was something he was looking for, so, instead of even looking at the sheath any longer, he shook his head, gaining a rather displeased sigh from Shunsui and a sad shrug from Jashiro. They had been trying to help him out for some time now to no avail. So no good, huh, and you still don't know what you're looking for either, right? Yet I just can't seem to picture something I would want in particular, but Shiba-sama. Upon hearing his name, Ichigo turned to look at the owner of the shop, disliking the formalities, but trying to appear pleasant anyway. Yes. Would this appease your needs? The elder man outstretched both his hands to show a scabbard hidden behind a white cloth, taking his free hand to reveal it as he took the previous cloth off and showing the full glory of the newly revealed scabbard. The sheath was indeed beautiful. It was natural black wood, no paint or decorations to be seen, but anyway shone with an undeniable glint of beauty and perfection as a deep red tassel snacked around the top part of the sheath to form the Seijio one. The scabbard had a simple wood carving of a lonely moon at the very tip where it was mostly usable, but anyway brought attention. It was something Ichigo had the honor of saying he had fallen in love with. This one. The sudden sound of his voice in the previous silence shocked his 2 classmates out of whatever stupor they had entered, and they were both able to quickly turn and stare at Ichigo without him even realizing. The sparks in Ichigo's shine kinda surprised the 2, but all the less satisfied them because this little piece of wood had apparently brought happiness to their new weird friend. Very well, Shiba-sama. 5. Once they had finished their shopping, they had started to make their way back to the academy. Excitement about their newfound shop being the current topic of conversation as Shunsui and Sherm tried to drag Ichigo the best they could in the conversation and proving somewhat satisfactory till the end. The peaceful banter quickly paused, however, as the vicinity of the gates came in sight, making both future captains stop on their tracks to try and gain a little bit if answers on the conversation they were all most likely wanting to avoid. Ichigo? Yeah? Why did you let Kei do what he did? The orange head was actually taken aback by the question, expecting something more along the lines of what the hell's up with that face. Or I guess you really are as fake as he said you were. However, he didn't really expect that question to be asked, almost like if he was the victim and that there was a reason for what he did and did not do something that wasn't entirely untrue and that there was something behind his calm and uncaring demeanor, which was positively true. Why are you unhappy? Ichigo. This is why he hated to interact with people lately. People that would only be there because they were curious or wanted something in return. People that he just couldn't find it in himself to trust no matter what, even if the evil overlord had yet to even be born. That is why he hated to socialize outside of his family. It sometimes became unbearable to continue with an uncaring facade. Why do you act like if it's all okay? Silence graced the clearing as the only real noise to be heard was the rustling of leaves. The leaves rustled once more as the breeze played with their light forms and made many fall in their wake. The chirps resounded slowly yet melodiously, letting a soothing sound fall upon the tense quiet that had been brought upon mere seconds ago, one that might as well be there to stay, because the 2 fifth-years were clearly not expecting the answer the orange head gave them. It was an answer that not even the silent eavesdrop didn't expect. Because nice words and nice appearance doesn't conclude that someone is nice, I believe that the nicer you look, the more deceptive you appear therefore. Ichigo turned to look at their shocked expressions, not in the least caring that he was saying something quite weird and at the same time true. It was their call if they understood. I did nothing to stop Kei, there was nothing to do about it, the result would be the same either way, you would always have undesired people around you, but desired ones are least likely. Fake is a trend lately anyway, a trend that hides those that only come home because they want a hot meal to eat, nothing else. Let me know in the comments below if you guys want the next part. Also check out my other video that has been shown and left. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and share this video. And have a fantastic day. Bye.